Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight's journey takes us to one of the oldest, most layered, and most misunderstood civilizations in human history. Long before Rome was a city, before Greece was a democracy, before most of the world had even heard the word empire, a people living on a vast plateau between mountains and desert had already built something that changed the shape of the earth. Their kings wrote laws about human rights, their engineers moved rivers, their poets described the soul with a precision that still makes people cry. This is the complete story of Iran, the empire the world forgot, the land between mountains and desert. The story of Iran does not begin with a king or a battle or a declaration. It begins with the land itself, and what land it is. The Iranian plateau stretches across roughly 2.5 million square kilometers, a vast tilted table of earth framed by some of the most dramatic geography on the planet. To the north, the Alborz mountain range rises in a green wall above the Caspian Sea, its peaks draped in forest and snow. The Zagros Mountains carve a jagged spine down the western edge of the country, their valleys deep and cold in winter, blazing in summer. To the east, the terrain softens into the great salt deserts, the Dashti Kavir and the Dashti Lut, among the most hostile environments on Earth. In the Dashti Lut, temperatures at the surface have been measured at nearly 70 degrees Celsius, which is the kind of heat that makes you reconsider every life decision you have ever made. Between these extremes lies a land of extraordinary variety. Fertile valleys thread through the mountain folds. Rivers carry snowmelt from high peaks down into lowland plains. Ancient underground water channels called kanats, engineered by hands we will never know, drew water horizontally through the earth for kilometers, allowing life to exist in places that should have been impossibly dry. The people who learned to live here did not simply adapt to their landscape, they mastered it, and that mastery became the foundation of everything that followed. The earliest evidence of human settlement on the Iranian plateau reaches back tens of thousands of years. Nomadic hunters left traces in caves and on rocky outcrops, their stone tools surviving where their names did not. By around 10,000 BCE, as the last ice age retreated, communities in the Zagros foothills began experimenting with farming. Goats were domesticated here. Wheat and barley were coaxed from the soil. These were not dramatic events marked by celebrations or announcements. They were quiet shifts in how people organized their days, gradual adjustments that accumulated over generations into something we now call civilization. By 6000 BCE, settled agricultural communities dotted the plateau. The site of Chogarmish in the southwestern lowlands shows evidence of a town with organized storage, pottery, and administrative symbols pressed into clay. People were not only growing food but counting it, recording transactions, beginning the slow invention of governance. Nearby, the site of Susa emerged as one of the most important early urban centers in the ancient world, a city that would be occupied, rebuilt, burned, and rebuilt again across 5,000 years of continuous habitation, which is a remarkable achievement for any city, and frankly, exhausting to even contemplate. The lowland region to the southwest of the plateau, bordering Mesopotamia, gave rise to one of the earliest distinct civilizations of the Iranian world, the Elamites. Elam was not Persia, not yet. Its people spoke a language unrelated to any we know well, wrote in their own script, and built a political tradition that interacted constantly with the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, sometimes trading with them, sometimes fighting them, sometimes conquering them outright. The Elamite capital of Susa became a city of palaces and ziggurats, its culture a blend of native traditions and Mesopotamian influences absorbed through centuries of contact. The Elamites were formidable in ways that history has undervalued. Their craftsmen produced bronze weapons and intricate cylinder seals. Their rulers conducted diplomacy across the known world. In the 12th century BCE, a general named Shutruk-Nahunte raided Babylon and carried off the famous stele bearing the code of Hammurabi, which suggests that the Elamites had not only sophisticated armies, but a refined appreciation for trophy collecting. The stele ended up in Susa, where it sat for more than 3,000 years before French archaeologists dug it up and took it to Paris, where it now lives in the Louvre. Some things, it seems, never stop being moved around. But while the Elamites built their civilization in the southwest, other peoples were arriving on the plateau from the north. Around 1500 BCE, or perhaps earlier, the historical record is frustratingly blurry here. Iranian-speaking peoples began migrating onto the plateau. They came from the steppes to the north, part of the great wave of Indo-Iranian migrations that spread across Asia and into Europe. They brought with them horses, cattle, a pantheon of gods, and a language that would eventually become the ancestor of Persian, the language still spoken by over 100 million people today. These newcomers were not a single unified people. They arrived in groups, settled in different regions, and over centuries differentiated into distinct cultures. Two of the most important groups were the Medes, who settled in the northwest, in the region around modern-day Hamadan, and the Persians, who initially settled farther south and east, eventually concentrating in the region known as Persis, the area around modern-day Shiraz. At this early stage, neither group was particularly powerful. They were tribal confederacies, pastoralists and farmers, navigating a world dominated by the great empires of the ancient Near East, particularly Assyria, which cast a long and brutal shadow over the entire region. Assyria is worth pausing on for a moment, because understanding what it meant to live in the Assyrian shadow helps explain why the Iranian empires that followed developed the way they did. The Assyrians were the most feared military power of the ancient world. Their armies used systematic terror as a tool of policy. Conquered peoples were deported, cities were destroyed with a thoroughness that was almost artistic, and kings composed inscriptions boasting of the piles of heads they had left outside city walls. They were, to put it diplomatically, a difficult neighbour. The Medes and Persians paid tribute to Assyria through much of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Assyrian records from this period mention them repeatedly, listing the horses, silver, and goods extracted from their lands. But tribute payments are not the same as submission of the spirit. While the Assyrian Empire squeezed the Iranian peoples for resources, those peoples were learning, watching, and waiting. They were absorbing the administrative techniques of the great empires around them. They were developing their own political structures. They were growing. The land they inhabited shaped them in specific ways that would echo through all the centuries that followed. The plateau's geography encouraged both pastoralism and agriculture, creating societies that understood movement and settlement with equal intimacy. The mountains created natural barriers that favoured decentralised confederacies, while the long valleys encouraged trade and communication. The presence of enormous deserts on the eastern edges pushed populations westward and southward, concentrating energy and ambition in the regions that would eventually become the heartlands of empire. And then there was the spiritual dimension. The Iranian peoples had brought with them from the steppes a religion centered on fire, purity, and the cosmic struggle between good and evil. Over centuries, this tradition was being refined and systematized. A figure named Zarathustra, whom the Greeks would call Zoroaster, was transforming these older beliefs into something more philosophically coherent, a religion that insisted on the individual's moral responsibility, on the importance of truth over lies, and on the idea that history itself was a great battle between the forces of light and darkness. When exactly Zarathustra lived is one of those questions that scholars enjoy arguing about at great length. Estimates range from 1800 BCE to 600 BCE, a range so wide that it's essentially unhelpful, but the tradition he founded would shape Iranian civilization in ways that outlasted every empire that came after. By the 7th century BCE, the stage was set. The Medes were gathering strength in the northwest. The Persians were consolidating in the south. The Assyrian Empire, for all its terrifying power, was beginning to show the cracks that always appear in structures built primarily on fear, and from a plateau between mountains and desert, a civilization was preparing to announce itself to the world. The Medes and the First Iranian Kingdom. The Medes were the first Iranian people to build something that could properly be called a kingdom, and they did it in the most satisfying way possible, by helping to destroy the empire that had been terrorizing them for generations. The rise of Median power is associated in ancient tradition with a figure named Deioces, whose story Herodotus tells with the kind of detail that makes you suspect at least some of it is invented. According to the account, Deioces was a man famous for his justice and wisdom, who settled disputes so fairly that people came to him from across the region. He then, reportedly, refused to continue doing this unless the Medes made him their king, which is either a masterclass in negotiating or an early example of holding an entire community emotionally hostage. Either way, it worked. The Medes crowned him, and he set about building a capital city called Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan, on a site in the Zagros highlands where 7 concentric walls of different colours rose in rings around a central palace. Ecbatana sat at an altitude of roughly 1,800 metres, which meant it was cool in summer and truly brutal in winter. but its location in the mountains gave it natural defences and placed it at the intersection of trade routes, connecting Mesopotamia with the eastern plateau and the steppes to the north. The city would remain important for the next 2,000 years, serving successive empires as a summer capital, a treasury, a refuge. Alexander would pass through it. The Parthians would favour it. The Sasanians would know it. There is something almost stubbornly alive about Ecbatana, a city that simply refused to stop mattering. The Median kingdom under Deioces and his successors slowly expanded its authority over the Iranian peoples of the northwest. The mechanisms of this expansion were the usual ones: military force, strategic marriages, and the gradual absorption of smaller tribal groups into a larger political framework. What made the Medes different from their neighbours was the particular discipline of their cavalry. The Iranian peoples had a long relationship with horses, and Median horsemen were considered among the best in the ancient world. Their mobility on the battlefield gave them advantages that foot-based armies struggled to counter. The decisive moment for Median power came in the reign of a king named Cyaxares, who ruled from roughly 625 to 585 BCE. Cyaxares reorganized the Median army, separating troops by weapon type, spearmen with spearmen, archers with archers, cavalry with cavalry, rather than the older tribal organization that had blurred these distinctions. This sounds like an administrative detail, but it was actually a military revolution, the kind of reorganization that turns a collection of warriors into an army. Cyaxares then did what many kings had dreamed of, and few had managed. He attacked Assyria. The timing was fortunate, which is perhaps being too kind to fortune and not kind enough to planning. The Assyrian Empire was entering a period of internal conflict and succession crisis. Nomadic peoples called the Scythians had recently disrupted the northern frontier. Babylon, long a resentful vassal of Assyria, was growing bold under new leadership. Cyaxares recognized that the giant was stumbling, and he moved accordingly. The alliance Cyaxares built was remarkable. He joined forces with the Babylonian king Nabopolassar, whose son would one day become Nebuchadnezzar the Great. Together, the Medes from the east and the Babylonians from the south converged on the heart of the Assyrian Empire. In 614 BCE, Cyaxares captured and destroyed Ashur, the ancient sacred capital of Assyria. 2 years later, in 612 BCE, the two allies together sacked Nineveh, the greatest city of the ancient world, the capital of the empire that had for centuries made the entire Near East tremble. The fall of Nineveh was so complete, so total, that within a few generations the city was buried under its own rubble and largely forgotten. When a Greek army marched past the site in the early 4th century BCE, they had no idea they were walking over the ruins of the world's former superpower. The Assyrian Empire that had seemed eternal vanished with a speed that astonished everyone who witnessed it. Even the prophet Nahum, writing around this time, could barely contain his satisfaction, describing Nineveh's fall in terms that are still remarkably visceral to read. The aftermath divided the Near East between the victors. The Babylonians took Syria and the Levant, the western portions of the former Assyrian realm. The Medes took the north and east, Assyria's old northern territories, parts of Anatolia, and eventually pushed their authority far enough east to include much of the Iranian plateau. For a brief period, the Median Empire was the largest state in the Western world. Its western border reached into modern-day Turkey, where Cyaxares clashed with the Lydian kingdom of Croesus, in a conflict that ended inconclusively, when a solar eclipse on the battlefield frightened both armies so thoroughly that they agreed to a peace treaty on the spot. The Greek philosopher Thales had apparently predicted this eclipse, which either marks the beginning of scientific astronomy or an extremely lucky guess, depending on your perspective. Median culture is something we know frustratingly little about. They left no texts, no royal inscriptions, no administrative records that have survived. What we know comes filtered through Greek sources, particularly Herodotus, who was writing a century and a half after the Median peak, and through Babylonian chronicles. The Medes appear in these sources as skilled horsemen, fine metal workers, and people with a particular taste for elaborate embroidery, which is either charming or beside the point, depending on what you are hoping to learn. What we can say with confidence is that the Medes created the first genuine Iranian imperial tradition. They established a capital, they organized a military, they built alliances and administered a territory that stretched across multiple cultures and peoples. They were not simply powerful warriors. They were the first architects of Iranian statehood, and the empires that came after them inherited both their achievements and their methods. The weakness of Median power lay in its relationship with its own constituent peoples. The Medes had never fully centralized authority. They ruled in part through the loyalty of subordinate kings and chiefs, particularly among the southern Persian tribes. And it was from among those southern Persian tribes that the next and far more consequential development was about to emerge. A young man from the Achaemenid clan of Persis, from a lineage of kings who had governed the Persians under Median suzerainty, was preparing to do something that would permanently alter the course of history. His name was Cyrus, and while the world does not always remember what it owes Iran, it at least remembers that. Cyrus the Great and the birth of the Achaemenid Empire. If you were going to design a founder figure for a great empire from scratch, you might design someone who looked a great deal like Cyrus II of Persia, whom posterity called Cyrus the Great, and who honestly earned the title. He came from the right lineage. He had the right ambitions. He possessed a particular quality that is rarer than military genius and more durable. He understood that conquered people who are well treated stay conquered, and that conquered people who are humiliated revolt at the first opportunity. In an ancient world where conquest routinely meant deportation, slavery, and the destruction of local temples, Cyrus operated on a different principle, and that principle changed everything. The story of his rise begins in the 550s BCE, when Cyrus was king of Anshan, a region in the southwest of the Iranian plateau, ruling as a vassal of the Median king Astyages. What exactly triggered the revolt remains unclear. Ancient sources offer various explanations, some involving dreams and prophecies, others involving the political grievances of Median nobles who were tired of Astyages and happy to support a challenger. What seems clear is that Cyrus moved against his Median overlord around 550 BCE, and that when the armies met, a significant portion of the Median forces defected to the Persian side. Astyages was captured. Ecbatana, the Median capital, was taken. But here is where Cyrus began demonstrating the quality that would define his legacy. He did not destroy Ecbatana. He did not massacre the Median nobility. He incorporated them into his new court, allowed them to maintain their positions, and essentially absorbed the Median kingdom rather than replacing it. The Medes became partners in the new empire rather than a defeated enemy. Cyrus even adopted elements of Median court ceremony and dress, signalling continuity rather than rupture. This was not sentimentality. It was brilliant politics. From this base, Cyrus moved with extraordinary speed. By 547 BCE, he had turned west and launched a campaign against Croesus, the famously wealthy king of Lydia in western Anatolia. Croesus had consulted the oracle at Delphi before the war, which told him that if he crossed the Halys River, a great empire would be destroyed. Croesus interpreted this as a green light and crossed the river. The oracle, as oracles tend to do, neglected to specify whose empire it was referring to. The answer turned out to be Croesus's own. The Lydian army was defeated, Sardis was captured, and Croesus himself was taken prisoner. Cyrus, in keeping with his pattern, reportedly treated him well. Whether this is historically accurate or legendary embellishment, it became part of the story people told about what kind of king Cyrus was. With Lydia conquered, Cyrus found himself in control of western Anatolia, including the Greek cities along the Aegean coast, which would become a source of persistent trouble for his successors, but an enormous source of wealth in the short term. The Ionian Greeks paid tribute, and their wealth and technical skills became part of the Persian imperial system. Then Cyrus turned east. We know less about these eastern campaigns than we do about the western ones, partly because the sources are thinner, and partly because the geography makes reconstruction difficult. But by the time Cyrus was done, the Persian Empire extended east to modern-day Afghanistan and possibly into Central Asia. He subdued Bactria, Sogdiana, the regions that would one day be known as the breadbasket of the Iranian world and the crossroads of the Silk Road. The sheer geographic scale of what he built in less than 2 decades of campaigning is staggering. And then came Babylon. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched against the Neo-Babylonian Empire, then ruled by Nabonidus, a king who had made himself extraordinarily unpopular with his own people through religious eccentricities and prolonged absences from the capital. Nabonidus had apparently been spending considerable time in the Arabian oasis of Tamar, neglecting the New Year festival, which was an extremely big deal in Babylonian religious life, and alienating the powerful priesthood of Marduk, Babylon's chief god. When Cyrus arrived with his armies, the Babylonian forces were defeated in battle at Opis. The city of Babylon itself opened its gates. What Cyrus did next became perhaps the most famous act of his career. He issued a proclamation, recorded on a clay cylinder now known as the Cyrus cylinder, which is currently in the British Museum and has been the subject of passionate diplomatic conversations between the British and Iranian governments for decades. The cylinder declares that Cyrus restored the temples and gods that Nabonidus had neglected, freed peoples who had been held captive in Babylon, including, by implication, the Jewish exiles whose return to Jerusalem is celebrated in the Hebrew Bible, and committed to ruling through consent and respect rather than terror. The Cyrus cylinder has been called the world's first charter of human rights, though modern scholars debate whether this description is anachronistic. It was certainly a piece of royal propaganda as much as a philosophical statement. Cyrus had good reasons to present himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. It reduced the cost of occupation, won the loyalty of the Babylonian priesthood, and presented him in the best possible light to the diverse peoples of his new empire. But propaganda and genuine principle are not always mutually exclusive, and the pattern of Cyrus's behavior across his career suggests that the values expressed in the cylinder were not simply cynical calculation. For the Jewish people in particular, the significance of Cyrus cannot be overstated. The prophet Isaiah refers to him as anointed by God, a remarkable designation for a foreign, non-Jewish king. Cyrus allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He restored their religious artifacts. He funded their restoration. In the Jewish tradition, Cyrus is not an enemy or a conqueror. He is a deliverer. He appears in the Book of Ezra, in Chronicles, in Isaiah. There is no other foreign king in the Hebrew Bible who is treated with such reverence. That fact alone tells you something about how differently Cyrus operated from the norms of his time. The empire he had built stretched from the Aegean coast in the west to the edges of India in the east, from the Aral Sea in the north to the first cataracts of the Nile in the south. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. And it was held together not primarily by terror, though the Persian army was certainly capable of terror when required, but by a system of administration that allowed conquered peoples to maintain their languages, their religions, their customs, and their local governing structures as long as they paid taxes and supplied soldiers when asked. Cyrus died in 530 BCE, fighting on the eastern frontier against the Massagetæ, a nomadic people led by a queen named Tomyris. The sources disagree on the details of his death, but most agree it was in battle, and most agree that it was not a death appropriate to the greatest king of the age. Tomyris reportedly had his body brought to her and cut off his head, then submerged it in a vessel of blood, declaring that she was giving him his fill of blood since he could not get enough of it in life. Whether this is history or legend is impossible to say, but it's very memorable. His body was returned to Persia and buried at Pasargadae, the city he had built as his capital in the heartland of Persis. His tomb still stands there, a simple rectangular structure of white limestone raised on 6 stepped platforms, utterly lacking in the kind of bombastic decoration that lesser kings used to compensate for lesser legacies. When Alexander the Great arrived at Pasargadae centuries later, he reportedly wept at the tomb and ordered it to be restored after his soldiers had looted it. The inscription on the tomb read, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come, I am Cyrus, who won the Persians their empire. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." That inscription, if authentic, is perhaps the most human thing any emperor has ever written. Darius, Xerxes, and the height of the Persian Empire Cyrus had built the empire. His son Cambyses extended it, conquering Egypt in 525 BCE, in a campaign that the Egyptians found deeply unpleasant and that added the oldest continuous civilization in the ancient world to the Persian realm. Cambyses died on his way back from Egypt under circumstances that remain unclear, possibly by accident, possibly by suicide, possibly by other means, and this opened the way for one of the most consequential reigns in Persian history. Darius I came to power in 522 BCE through a combination of military force, aristocratic conspiracy, and an impressive ability to manage a crisis. The empire he inherited was in chaos. Several pretenders had claimed the throne. Rebellions had broken out across the realm. In a single year, Darius fought 19 battles against 9 kings. He recorded all of this in exhaustive, self-congratulatory detail in the Great Behistun inscription, carved high on a cliff face in the Zagros Mountains, which the travellers had to stare up at from the road below, and which serves as one of the most important historical documents of the ancient world. The inscription was carved in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, and it was the key that eventually unlocked the Babylonian cuneiform script for modern scholars, making it the Persian equivalent of the Rosetta Stone. Darius was not a romantic figure in the way Cyrus was. He was an administrator, a builder, an organizer, and he was very, very good at all three. Where Cyrus had expanded the empire through charisma and military brilliance, Darius gave it structure. He reorganized the realm into 20 satrapies, administrative provinces each governed by a satrap, essentially a royal governor, who was responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and supplying troops. Each satrapy was also subject to inspection by royal officials called the eyes and ears of the king, who travelled the empire checking on the satrap's conduct, which was an early form of audit that satraps presumably found just as stressful as modern employees find audits. Darius also created a standardized coinage, the gold daric and silver siglos, which facilitated trade across the enormous empire and gave merchants from Egypt to India a common medium of exchange. He built or improved a royal road system connecting the key cities of the empire, particularly the famous road from Susa to Sardis, roughly 2,700 kilometers, along which a network of postal relay stations allowed royal messages to travel the entire distance in 7 days. Herodotus describes these couriers with a phrase that was eventually adopted as the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service: "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Though of course Herodotus was describing the Persian system. The postal service borrowed the line. You could argue the Persians should receive credit. Darius built his capital at Persepolis, the city whose ruins still stand in the province of Fars, and which remain some of the most breathtaking archaeological sites in the world. Persepolis was not a commercial capital. It was a ceremonial one, a stage set for imperial ritual. The Great Apadana, the audience hall, could hold hundreds of people and was decorated with carved reliefs showing delegations from every corner of the empire bringing tribute to the king. These carvings are remarkable not for their martial boasting, but for their almost gentle dignity. The subject peoples are shown not as captives or defeated enemies, but as participants, each group depicted in their own distinctive clothing, carrying their own distinctive gifts, proud representatives of their own cultures. This is what the Persian Empire wanted to look like to itself, a voluntary community of civilizations, united under the great king who stood at the center of the world. Whether the reality matched the image is another question. The Persian Empire was not a modern democracy. The king's power was absolute. Rebellions were crushed. Taxes were mandatory. But by the standards of ancient empires, and by the standards of some empires that came after them, the Persian approach to governing diverse peoples was genuinely more tolerant than the alternatives. They let people worship their own gods. They let communities govern themselves by their own laws. They promoted talented administrators from conquered peoples to senior positions. There is a reason that under Persian rule Egypt flourished. Babylon remained the financial capital of the Near East, and the Jewish community in Persia eventually produced the books of Esther and Daniel, neither of which depicts Persia as a land of oppression. But Darius's reign is also remembered for something less flattering: the beginning of the Persian Wars with Greece. And here we need to spend a moment acknowledging an uncomfortable truth about how history has been written. The Persian Wars are overwhelmingly known to us through Greek sources, primarily Herodotus, and from the perspective of the Greek city-states. In that telling, the wars are a heroic struggle of free Greeks against the overwhelming force of Oriental despotism, a story of Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis, of outnumbered defenders holding back the tide of empire. It is a genuinely thrilling narrative. It also tells only half the story, and somewhat ignores the fact that from the Persian perspective, these were relatively minor frontier skirmishes involving rebellious tributaries and their troublesome western cousins. The immediate cause was the Ionian Revolt of 499 BCE, when the Greek cities of western Anatolia, which had been under Persian control since the time of Cyrus, rose in rebellion. Athens and Eretria sent ships in support. The revolt was suppressed, but Darius took note of the Athenian involvement and decided that the mainland Greek cities needed to be reminded of Persian authority. He sent an expedition in 490 BCE, which ended at the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians, assisted by the Plataeans, defeated the Persian force in a battle that the Greeks regarded as a miracle, and the Persians regarded as an annoying tactical reverse. Darius died in 486 BCE before he could mount the larger invasion he was planning. His son Xerxes, known to Iranians by his Persian name Kashayar, completed the preparation and launched the Great Invasion of Greece in 480 BCE. The numbers ancient sources give for the Persian army are wildly exaggerated. Herodotus claims over 2 million men, which would have been logistically impossible. Modern estimates suggest something between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, which is still an enormous force by ancient standards, and represented a genuine mobilization of imperial resources. The famous battles followed. The 300 Spartans and their allies held the pass of Thermopylae long enough to become the most famous last stand in Western history, though the Persian force eventually found a way around through a mountain path revealed by a local Greek. The Persians sacked Athens, burning the Acropolis. But at the naval battle of Salamis, the Athenian fleet lured the larger Persian navy into the narrow channel, where numbers became a disadvantage and inflicted a crushing defeat. Xerxes watched the battle from a throne on a hilltop above the strait, which sounds dramatic but also meant he had an excellent view of his fleet being destroyed. The Persian land army was defeated at Plataea the following year. The invasions were over. For Greece, these wars became definitional. The victory over Persia was the foundation myth of Greek identity, the proof that Greek freedom and virtue could triumph over Eastern despotism and numbers. For Persia, they were a distant episode in the reign of an empire that spanned dozens of other frontiers and managed dozens of other crises. The Greek wars are on every page of Greek history. They are a footnote in the Persian imperial record. This disproportion has shaped how the world remembers the Achaemenid Empire ever since. We know the story of Thermopylae in remarkable detail. We know almost nothing about what was happening simultaneously in the Persian satrapy of Bactria, or along the trade routes connecting Susa to India, or in the Nile Valley where Egyptian priests continued their rituals under Persian administration. The history we know is the history the Greeks wrote down, and the Greeks were understandably most interested in the part where they were the heroes. The Achaemenid Empire continued for another century and a half after Xerxes, generally declining in vigour, but never entirely losing its coherence. The later Achaemenid kings dealt with revolts, succession crises, and the growing influence of court factions, particularly the powerful queen mothers and royal women who exercised significant informal authority. But the empire held. It remained the superpower of the ancient world, until a young Macedonian king arrived from an unexpected direction and changed everything: Persian culture, daily life, and the world they built. Before we watch the Achaemenid Empire fall, it is worth pausing to understand what it was from the inside. Empires are not only armies and tax collectors. They are the meals people cook, the songs people sing, the prayers people offer in the evening when the day's work is done. The Persian Empire at its height was not only the largest political entity in the world, it was one of the most culturally complex, and the daily life of the people within it tells a story that the battlefield accounts miss entirely. Start with the capital, Persepolis, but not the throne room or the audience hall. Start with the fortification tablets found buried near the northern gate, 30,000 clay tablets written in Elamite that record the daily operations of the palace economy. These tablets are a snapshot of an entire world. They list rations of grain, beer, wine, and meat distributed to workers, from stone carvers to women's work gangs to royal servants. They record travel allowances for officials moving between cities. They document payments to skilled craftsmen from Greece, Lydia, Egypt, and points east, all working together on the construction projects of the king. What is striking about these tablets is the remarkable diversity they reveal. The Persian court was genuinely international. Workers and officials from dozens of nations received equal pay for equal work, at least according to the tablets. Women who were nursing infants received higher rations than other workers, a detail that is either touching evidence of imperial concern for mothers or an entirely practical recognition that lactating women need more calories, probably both. The administrative logic that drove the Persian imperial system was, in many ways, deeply practical and not without a kind of rough fairness. The Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, shaped the culture in profound ways. At its core, Zoroastrianism was a dualistic religion, positing a cosmic struggle between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the god of light, truth, and good, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the source of lies, darkness, and evil. Every person was called to choose sides, not through passive belief but through active moral engagement. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. The simplicity of this moral framework was in some ways its great strength. It was not a religion that required elaborate priestcraft to access. It was a religion that asked you to think carefully about whether what you were doing was contributing to light or to darkness. Fire was sacred in Zoroastrianism, regarded as the visible representation of Ahura Mazda's divine light. Fire temples maintained eternal flames that were tended by priests called magi. The magi had enormous influence in Persian society, and their existence filtered into Greek accounts in the form of the magi who appear in the story of the Nativity. The 3 wise men from the east who followed a star, a detail that suggests how deeply Persian religious culture had penetrated the Near Eastern world by the time of Christ. The concept of truth, Ata in Old Persian, was central to Achaemenid ideology. The royal inscriptions return again and again to the king's commitment to truth and his opposition to the lie, druj. This was not merely rhetorical. The administrative system depended on accurate record-keeping, honest accounting, and reliable testimony. The empire worked partly because it enforced something close to institutional honesty at the administrative level. Not perfectly by any means, but enough to give it structural coherence. Persian art is immediately recognizable even after 2,500 years. The carved reliefs of Persepolis show figures of elongated elegance, their beards carefully curled, their robes falling in precise geometric folds, their expressions serene and formal. This is royal art, art in the service of ideology, showing the world as the king wished it to be seen. But the decorative arts, the jewellery, the metalwork, the textiles that survive or are described in ancient sources reveal a much more exuberant aesthetic. The Persians loved colour, pattern, and the precise rendering of animals. Rhytons, ceremonial drinking vessels shaped like animal foreparts, were produced in gold and silver. Carpets, now lost to time, were apparently of extraordinary quality and artistry. The Persian love of gardens deserves special mention. The Persian word for an enclosed garden was paradaiza, which gave us the word paradise. And Persian gardens were not simply pretty spaces for relaxation. They were philosophical statements, ordered representations of the cosmos, with water channels dividing the space into geometric sections, trees and flowers arranged with intention, the human capacity for order and beauty imposed on the natural world. The garden as paradise, as a foretaste of what a well-ordered world might look like, is a Persian gift to human imagination that has endured through Islamic garden design, through Persian miniature painting, through the word paradise itself, embedded in dozens of languages. What did ordinary Persians eat? The picture is incomplete but suggestive. The staple grains were barley and wheat. Meat from sheep and goats was common, with cattle reserved for wealthier households. Wine was ubiquitous and important, with the Persians producing excellent vintages from their mountain vineyards. They also consumed a great deal of beer, which was the everyday drink of the working population. The fortification tablets show that beer was a standard ration for construction workers, which suggests that the great monuments of Persepolis were built, at least in part, on a foundation of fermented grain. This information feels important somehow. Dates, figs, pomegranates, and other fruits were widely consumed. The pomegranate in particular became a symbol of Persian identity, its hundreds of seeds representing abundance and fertility. It appears in Persian art, in religious symbolism, and in the cuisine that persists to this day. When you eat a modern Iranian dish rich with pomegranate molasses, you are tasting something that would have been recognizable to an Achaemenid farmer. Women in the Persian Empire occupied a complex position. At the elite level, royal women and court women could exercise considerable power. The Queen Mother in particular was a figure of authority, and several Achaemenid queens, including Atossa, daughter of Cyrus and wife of Darius, appear in the historical record as politically active figures. The fortification tablets show women working in skilled positions, receiving rations, travelling on official business. This is not a picture of a society where women were invisible, but it is also not a picture of equality. Women's authority was real but constrained, exercised within a framework that ultimately centred on male royal power. Trade connected the Persian Empire to the wider world in ways that distributed Persian cultural influence across thousands of kilometres. The Silk Road, though it would not be formalised until later, had its roots in the Achaemenid trading networks that connected the Mediterranean to Central Asia and India. Persian merchants carried not only goods but ideas. Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic dualism influenced later Judaism, which in turn shaped Christianity and Islam. The Persian administrative model influenced subsequent empires, including that of Alexander, who hired Persian bureaucrats to run the lands he conquered because they were the only people who knew how to do it. Persian artistic motifs appeared in Greek pottery, in Scythian goldwork, in Buddhist temples in Afghanistan. The Persian Empire was not a distant fact. It was the world that everyone in the ancient Near East lived inside, breathed, traded with, and was shaped by, whether they acknowledged it or not. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire and Alexander's conquest. Every empire that has ever existed has eventually ended, and the Achaemenid Empire, for all its sophistication and longevity, was no exception. The manner of its ending has shaped how it has been remembered, because history tends to be written from the perspective of whoever comes next, and whoever came next was determined to write a particular kind of story. The later Achaemenid kings faced challenges that any large empire would recognize: succession struggles, court factions, provincial ambitions, and the perennial difficulty of maintaining central authority over territories that were weeks of travel from the capital. The reign of Artaxerxes II, who ruled from 404 to 359 BCE, was long but turbulent, featuring the famous revolt of his brother Cyrus the Younger, whose march to the heart of the empire with 10,000 Greek mercenaries was immortalized by Xenophon in the Anabasis. Cyrus the Younger died in the Battle of Cunaxa, making his entire campaign rather pointless, but Xenophon's account of the Greeks marching home through a hostile empire gave an entire generation of Greeks an intimate look at Persian territory, and concluded that the empire might be more vulnerable than it appeared. By the reign of Darius III, who came to power in 336 BCE, the empire was weakened but not collapsed. The satrapies still functioned. The army could still be mobilized on a massive scale. The treasury at Persepolis still held treasures that would fund an invading army's operations for years. But the center of the empire had lost something that is very difficult to define precisely and very easy to feel in the historical record: a sense of confident direction. The great kings were gone. What remained were administrators. Into this situation came Alexander of Macedon, 22 years old, recently crowned, possessed of an almost pathological military genius and a literary education that had given him a very particular way of thinking about himself. Alexander had read Achilles. He wanted to be Achilles. He had also absorbed the Greek cultural narrative about the Persian Wars, the story in which Persia was the great enemy of Greek freedom, and he was determined to complete the revenge that had been left unfinished after Salamis. This combination of personal mythology and political ideology made him extraordinarily dangerous. His first major victory over the Persians came at the Granicus River in 334 BCE, where he defeated a Persian force in northwestern Anatolia through a cavalry charge of almost suicidal boldness. He then moved south through Anatolia, liberating the Greek cities, and continuing to Issus in 333 BCE, where he faced Darius III himself and inflicted a shattering defeat. Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning his family, his treasury, and his dignity. His mother, wife, and daughters were captured by Alexander, who reportedly treated them with great respect, calling Darius's mother Sisygambis by the honorific mother and apparently maintaining a genuine affection for her throughout his life. Sisygambis returned the feeling. When she learned of Alexander's death years later, she's said to have starved herself to grieve him. After Issus, Alexander moved south into the Levant and Egypt, securing his Mediterranean flank before turning east. He was welcomed in Egypt as a liberator, crowned pharaoh, and visited the oracle of Ammon in the desert, who apparently confirmed his divine parentage to his complete satisfaction. Then he turned back east to deal with the main Persian force. The decisive battle came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, in a plain in what is now northern Iraq. Darius had chosen flat ground to maximize the effectiveness of his scythed chariots. Alexander broke through the Persian line by identifying a gap and leading his companion cavalry personally through it, driving toward Darius himself with the focused intention of making it personal. Darius fled again. His army collapsed. The empire effectively ended at Gaugamela, though the physical occupation would take more years. Babylon surrendered without a fight. Susa surrendered. Alexander reached Persepolis and took possession of the greatest treasury in the world. He also held a party that got somewhat out of control, and in the aftermath of the party, the palace complex of Persepolis was burned. Ancient sources debate whether this was a deliberate political act, revenge for the Persian burning of Athens in 480 BCE, or an accident caused by a drunken night of celebrations. The Macedonian general Parmenion apparently tried to talk Alexander out of it. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire, the place where the carving showed all the peoples of the world bringing tribute in dignity, was reduced to ashes and rubble. Archaeologists have recovered the charred remains of wooden beams, burned archives, melted gold. The fire was very real and very thorough. Darius III was not at Persepolis. He had fled east, hoping to raise another army. He was murdered by one of his own satraps, Bessus, who then proclaimed himself the new king of Persia. Alexander hunted Bessus down, outraged not by the murder itself, but by the murder of someone who was rightfully his enemy to defeat. He found Darius's body on the road, reportedly mourned him, and arranged a royal burial. Then he continued east, eventually reaching the borders of India before his exhausted army refused to go any further. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32, of causes that are still debated. His empire was divided among his generals, and the Iranian plateau fell under the control of the Seleucid dynasty, the heirs of his general Seleucus. But something important had happened to the Iranian world during Alexander's conquest, something that would shape the next centuries. The Persian administrative class had survived, the Zoroastrian priests had survived, the Iranian languages and cultural traditions had survived. Alexander had destroyed the Achaemenid dynasty, but he had not destroyed the Persian civilization that dynasty had expressed. That civilization was deeper than any one political structure, and it would outlast every conqueror who tried to replace it. The Achaemenid Empire had lasted 220 years, from Cyrus's revolt against the Medes to Darius's flight from Gaugamela. In those 2 centuries, it had established the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, pioneered a model of pluralistic administration that influenced every empire that came after it, created an architectural and artistic tradition of extraordinary beauty, and connected the Mediterranean to Central Asia in a web of trade and communication that persisted long after the empire itself was gone. What remained was the idea of Persia, and ideas, as the subsequent 2,500 years would demonstrate, are much harder to kill than empires. The Parthians, the empire Rome could never conquer. The Seleucid dynasty that inherited the eastern portions of Alexander's empire tried to be Greek in a world that was not particularly interested in becoming Greek. They built Greek-style cities with Greek temples and Greek theatres across the Iranian plateau and Central Asia. They called their new foundations Antioch and Seleucia and Laodice. They promoted Greek culture, Greek language, Greek administration, and for a while, they succeeded well enough to make this the period historians call the Hellenistic Age, a time when Greek culture spread across the ancient world on the back of Macedonian military power. But the Iranian plateau had its own opinions, and gradually, inexorably, those opinions reasserted themselves. The Parthians were a nomadic people from the steppes to the northeast of the Caspian Sea, from a region called Parthia, roughly modern-day northeastern Iran and western Turkmenistan. In the mid-3rd century BCE, around 247 BCE, under a leader named Arsaces, they began expanding southward into the weakening Seleucid territories. The details of the early Arsacid expansion are murky, as the Parthians left few records from this period, and we rely on hostile Greek and later Roman sources. But the broad arc is clear. A semi-nomadic people, skilled horsemen with deep experience of the steppe warfare tradition, found that the Seleucid grip on the Iranian plateau was slipping and decided to fill the vacuum. What followed was one of the most interesting dynasty buildings in ancient history, because the Parthians were not simply new conquerors imposing a new order. They were inheritors of an extraordinarily complex cultural landscape, and they responded to it with a flexibility that was either genuine tolerance or strategic pragmatism, and in practice the distinction barely matters. The Arsacid kings presented themselves differently to different subject peoples. To Greeks and Hellenized populations they used Greek titles and Greek coinage imagery. To Iranian peoples they emphasized their role as restorers of Iranian tradition. To Babylonians and Mesopotamians they adopted local titulary and patronized local temples. This shape-shifting quality made them difficult to pin down as rulers, but it also made their empire remarkably stable. By the mid-2nd century BCE, under Mithridates I, the Parthians had conquered Persia, Media and Mesopotamia, absorbing the heartlands of the old Achaemenid Empire. When Mithridates defeated the Seleucid king Demetrius II in 139 BCE and captured him alive, the Parthian Empire was effectively complete. They ruled from the Euphrates in the west to the edge of Bactria in the east. They were the heirs of the Achaemenids in all but name, and it was at this point that the Parthians ran into Rome. The encounter between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Republic which became the Roman Empire under Augustus, is one of the great geopolitical confrontations of the ancient world, and it lasted nearly 300 years without either side achieving decisive victory. The Romans were accustomed to confronting enemies they could eventually defeat through persistence and overwhelming numbers. The Parthians proved infuriatingly resistant to this approach. The first catastrophic lesson came at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE. The Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the three men in the First Triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, led a force of approximately 40,000 men deep into Mesopotamian territory. He was confident, experienced, and wealthy enough to fund his own campaigns, which was a Roman peculiarity. He was also about to face something he had never encountered. The Parthian commander Surena met the Roman force at Carrhae, modern-day Harran in Turkey, with a force that was dramatically smaller in number, but entirely cavalry-based. His key weapon was a combination of horse archers and heavily armoured cataphracts, mounted lancers whose horses were also armoured. The horse archers did something that drove the Romans to distraction. They kept retreating while firing backward, the famous Parthian shot, maintaining a steady rain of arrows on the Roman infantry, while never getting close enough for the legions to engage. The Romans formed their famous tortoise formation, shields overlapping overhead and on the sides, but the Parthian arrows were powerful enough to penetrate even this defence at close range, and every time the Romans advanced, the horse archers withdrew. When the Romans stood still, the cataphracts charged. When they moved, the horse archers retreated and shot. The battle was a controlled slaughter. Crassus himself was killed, and legend has it that the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat in mockery of his famous wealth, which is perhaps apocryphal but certainly memorable. 7 standards of the legions were captured, which was an almost unspeakable humiliation in Roman military culture. 20,000 Romans were killed, and 10,000 captured. It was Rome's worst defeat in a century. Carrhae established the fundamental dynamic of the Roman-Parthian relationship. Rome could win on the open battlefield when it could get to grips with the enemy, but getting to grips with the Parthians, who could always retreat into the vast spaces of their empire and then threaten the flanks and supply lines of any advancing army, was extremely difficult. The Euphrates River became the de facto border between the two empires, crossed occasionally in both directions for campaigns that proved ultimately inconclusive. Julius Caesar was reportedly planning a major Parthian campaign when he was assassinated in 44 BCE. Mark Antony launched an invasion in 36 BCE that ended in a disastrous retreat, losing a third of his army to Parthian harassment and Armenian treachery. The Emperor Trajan conquered Mesopotamia in 115 CE and briefly reached the Persian Gulf, reportedly weeping that he was too old to follow in Alexander's footsteps to India. But his successors almost immediately abandoned the territory. The Emperor Hadrian restored the Euphrates border. The pattern held for 3 centuries. Inside the Parthian Empire during all of this, life went on in ways that are tantalizingly difficult to reconstruct. The Parthians were not great builders of the kind that leave archaeological records. They preferred nomadic-influenced architecture and perishable materials. They left few inscriptions. Most of what we know about Parthian culture comes from Greek and Roman sources, which are interested primarily in warfare and diplomacy, and from the gradually accumulating evidence of archaeology. What we can say is that the Parthian Empire was the great intermediary of the Silk Road. The trade routes that connected China to the Roman world passed through Parthian territory, and the Arsacid kings collected tolls and profited enormously from this transit. Chinese silk, Roman glass, Indian spices, Central Asian horses all moved through the Parthian realm. The city of Ctesiphon on the Tigris became the Parthian capital, and one of the great cities of the ancient world, its size and wealth astonishing visitors from both east and west. The Parthians also maintained Iranian traditions that the Seleucids had attempted to Hellenize away. Zoroastrianism continued to be practiced, though in a somewhat decentralized form. The Iranian epics and oral traditions that would eventually be written down in the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, were being preserved and transmitted during this period. The memory of the Achaemenid kings was honoured. The Parthian kings called themselves Kings of Kings, the Achaemenid title, claiming continuity with the great tradition that Alexander had interrupted. The Parthian dynasty ended not from Roman conquest but from internal rebellion. In 224 CE, a local Persian king named Ardashir from the province of Fars, the ancient heartland of the Achaemenids, revolted against the last Arsacid king and defeated him in battle. The Parthian dynasty fell. A new dynasty, calling itself the Sasanians after a legendary ancestor named Sasan, took control of the Iranian world, and Persia, after 5 centuries of Parthian rule, was ready to announce itself again. The Sasanian Empire, Persia reborn. If the Parthian Empire was Persia holding its breath, the Sasanian Empire was Persia exhaling with considerable force. The dynasty that Ardashir I founded in 224 CE was self-consciously, deliberately, almost aggressively Persian. Where the Arsacids had been culturally flexible, presenting themselves differently to different audiences, the Sasanians planted their flag firmly in the Iranian tradition, declared Zoroastrianism the state religion, revived Persian as the language of administration, and set about rebuilding the world that Alexander had burned. Ardashir's own rise was the kind of story that is so vivid it seems almost like legend, though the bones of it are historical. He was a local king in Persis, the province that had once been the heartland of the Achaemenids. He was also reportedly a priest, or at least closely connected to the Zoroastrian priestly establishment. He defeated the last Arsacid king Artabanus IV in battle in 224 CE, and then consolidated his power over the whole Iranian plateau with remarkable speed. His rock reliefs, carved into cliff faces in his home province, show him receiving the royal diadem from Ahura Mazda himself, the divine sanction made literally visible in stone. His son Shapur I extended the empire and did something that no Iranian king before him had achieved. He defeated and captured a Roman emperor. At the Battle of Edessa in 260 CE, Shapur defeated the Roman army and captured the Emperor Valerian alive. Valerian was the first Roman emperor ever captured by an enemy, and Shapur made absolutely certain that the world knew about it. He had the victory commemorated in enormous rock reliefs at Nakshi Rostam, the cliff face near Persepolis where the Achaemenid kings were buried. In these carvings, Valerian kneels before the mounted Shapur, who extends his hand in what might be mercy or might be command. Other carvings show Valerian serving as a footstool for Shapur's foot when mounting his horse, a humiliation that Roman sources found incomparably mortifying to record. What happened to Valerian after his capture is unclear. Some sources suggest he spent the rest of his life in Persian captivity, treated reasonably, but never released. Whatever the precise details, the image of a Roman emperor kneeling before an Iranian king carved into the eternal rock tells you something important about the confidence of the Sasanian Empire and its determination to be taken seriously. The Sasanian state was organized around 3 pillars: the monarchy, the Zoroastrian priesthood, and the military aristocracy. The Zoroastrian church under the Sasanians became institutionalized in a way it had never been under the Parthians. A chief priest called the Mobadan Mobed, the high priest of high priests, became a figure of enormous authority. The Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, were collected and codified. Fire temples were established and maintained by state funding. Religious orthodoxy was enforced, and religious minorities, including Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and later Manichaeans, experienced varying levels of tolerance and persecution depending on the particular king and the political climate. Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, was a Sasanian subject, born in Mesopotamia around the time of Ardashir's rise. His religion, which synthesized elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism into a new dualistic faith, initially gained support from Shapur I, but was condemned and its founder executed under Shapur's successor Bahram I. Manichaeism nonetheless spread westward into the Roman Empire and eastward into Central Asia and China, becoming for several centuries one of the major world religions, which tells you something about the intellectual ferment of the Sasanian world. The great wars between the Sasanians and Rome, then Byzantium, defined the military history of the ancient and late antique world. These wars were waged across the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries with varying fortunes, always along the same contested frontier in Mesopotamia and Armenia. The wars were expensive, exhausting, and ultimately inconclusive. Both empires developed sophisticated defensive systems of fortified towns, military colonies, and border garrisons. Armies grew enormous, with both sides using war elephants, cataphracts, and siege equipment of increasing sophistication. The philosophical and religious dimensions of these wars were as important as the military ones. The Sasanian Empire presented itself as the champion of Zoroastrian civilization against the Christian Roman Empire. The Roman Byzantine Empire increasingly presented itself as the defender of Christian civilization against the Zoroastrian Persian threat. Both sides treated their wars as civilizational struggles, which made peace negotiations simultaneously more necessary, since both civilizations were genuinely tired, and more difficult since civilizational struggles are harder to resolve through compromise than purely territorial disputes. Under Khosrow I, known in Persian tradition as Anushirvan the Just, who ruled from 531 to 579 CE, the Sasanian Empire reached perhaps its administrative and cultural peak. Khosrow reformed the tax system, reorganized the army, patronized scholars and philosophers, and famously welcomed Greek philosophers expelled from Athens when the Emperor Justinian closed the Platonic Academy in 529 CE. The story of Greek philosophers finding refuge at the Sasanian court, bringing with them texts of Plato and Aristotle, and engaging in intellectual exchange with Persian and Indian scholars, is one of those moments that deserves to be much more famous than it is. Khosrow's court became a place where the intellectual traditions of Greece, Persia, India, and Mesopotamia met and fertilized each other. The translation movement that would later flourish in Islamic Baghdad had its roots here. Chess was reportedly introduced to Khosrow's court from India during this period, and the Persians returned the favour by sending India the game of backgammon. If these traditions are accurate, then the Sasanian court was responsible for two of the most enduring board games in human history, which seems like a fairly solid intellectual legacy regardless of anything else they accomplished. The final great Sasanian king, Khosrow II, known as Parviz, the Victorious, nearly destroyed the Byzantine Empire. His armies conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and even briefly threatened Constantinople itself between 610 and 628 CE. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius responded with one of the most remarkable military campaigns of late antiquity, striking deep into the Sasanian heartland, while Khosrow's armies occupied the Roman territories. Heraclius drove the Persians back, recovered the true cross that they had taken from Jerusalem, and forced a peace on terms that left both empires dramatically weakened. The wars between Khosrow Parviz and Heraclius were the last great conflict of the ancient world. When they ended, both empires were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their armies diminished, their populations exhausted by decades of devastating war. Neither side had the strength to resist what came next, and what came next was something that neither empire had seen coming: a new religion from the Arabian Peninsula, carried by armies of a ferocity and conviction that made everything they had built seem suddenly vulnerable: the coming of Islam and the Arab conquest. In the early 7th century CE, while the Byzantine and Sasanian empires were bleeding each other nearly to death, something was happening in the Arabian Peninsula that would change the history of the world. In Mecca, a merchant named Muhammad began receiving revelations that would form the basis of Islam. In Medina, a community formed around his teachings. By the time of his death in 632 CE, most of the Arabian Peninsula was under Muslim control. What happened in the following decade is still astonishing to contemplate. The Arab armies that emerged from the peninsula after Muhammad's death were driven by a combination of religious conviction, economic need, military innovation, and the remarkable fortune of finding their two great neighbours in a state of mutual exhaustion. The Byzantine Empire had just survived Khosrow Parviz's conquests with its core territories intact, but its strength severely diminished. The Sasanian Empire was in the middle of a succession crisis of such chaos that it had 6 or 7 kings in rapid succession during the critical years when it needed decisive leadership most. The Arab forces met the Sasanian army at the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 CE in the flatlands of southern Iraq near the Euphrates. The battle lasted 3 or 4 days, a prolonged and bitter struggle that the Arab forces eventually won when a sandstorm disrupted the Persian lines, and the Sasanian general Rustam was killed. Ctesiphon, the great Sasanian capital, fell shortly after. The last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, fled east, seeking help that never came. He was murdered by a miller near Merv in 652 CE, alone and abandoned, the last of a dynasty that had ruled Iran for 400 years. The conquest of Iran was not quick, and it was not without resistance. Unlike the conquest of Mesopotamia, which had a long history of accepting new rulers, the Iranian plateau had to be fought over extensively. Cities fell, were sometimes retaken, and fell again. Local rulers negotiated varying terms of surrender. The population did not simply accept the new order. But over the following decades, the Arab armies and their allies penetrated the entire plateau, reaching Central Asia by the end of the 7th century. What the Arab conquest meant for Iran is a question that has been debated with great passion by Iranian thinkers for 14 centuries, and the debate continues today. It was undeniably a catastrophe for the Sasanian state and for Zoroastrianism as a majority religion. The fire temples were converted into mosques. The Zoroastrian nobility lost their lands and privileges. Many members of the elite converted to Islam voluntarily or under social pressure. The Zoroastrian community in Iran shrank over subsequent centuries to a small minority, with many followers emigrating to India, where they became the Parsi, the name a memory of their Persian origin, and where they maintained their faith and traditions with remarkable fidelity. Today there are perhaps 120,000 Parsis in India, the living descendants of those who refused to convert. But the story of the Arab conquest of Iran is not simply a story of destruction. Islam did not erase Iranian civilization. What happened instead was one of the most complex acts of cultural transformation in history. The Iranians absorbed Islam and then proceeded to profoundly shape the form that Islam took in the world. The Arabic language became the language of religion, scholarship, and administration. But Persian survived. In fact, Persian survived and eventually flourished in a new form called New Persian, written in Arabic script but grammatically and lexically continuous with the old language, and capable of expressing the full range of human experience with a lyrical power that would produce some of the greatest poetry ever written. The Arabic-Persian synthesis that emerged from the conquest was not a subordination of Iran to Arabia. It was a fusion that created something new and in many ways more magnificent than either tradition alone. Within a generation or two of the conquest, Iranians were among the most important scholars, administrators, and intellectual figures in the Islamic world. The bureaucratic class that had run the Sasanian Empire simply transferred its skills to the new order. Iranian converts to Islam brought with them administrative techniques, philosophical traditions, and cultural memories that shaped early Islamic civilization at every level. When the Abbasid Caliphate emerged in 750 CE and established Baghdad as its capital, the new city was built on the model of Sasanian urban planning, staffed by Iranian administrators using Iranian administrative techniques, and surrounded by Iranian cultural influences so pervasive that the court of Harun al-Rashid, the famous caliph of the Arabian Nights, was in many ways more Iranian than Arab. The conquest changed Iran. But Iran also changed the conquest. Persia, under the caliphates. Survival of a civilization. The first century of Arab rule over Iran was, by any honest assessment, a period of significant trauma. The Sasanian ruling class was displaced. The Zoroastrian establishment lost its state sponsorship. Land ownership patterns changed dramatically. Many Iranians found themselves in a new and uncomfortable position, a conquered people in a land their ancestors had ruled for centuries. But the mechanisms by which Iranian civilization survived and reasserted itself are fascinating to trace. The key was the Islamic concept of dhimis, protected peoples of the book, which gave non-Muslim communities in Islamic territories the right to practice their faith, maintain their communities, and manage their internal affairs in exchange for the payment of a special tax called the jizya. Zoroastrians were eventually included in this category, though there was some theological debate about it, since they were not obviously a people of the Abrahamic book. The inclusion was a practical recognition of how important the Iranian population was to the functioning of the empire. Iranian converts to Islam, meanwhile, occupied a complex social position. In theory, Islam was a religion without ethnic hierarchy. The Prophet had explicitly condemned Arab tribalism. In practice, the early Islamic empire was dominated by Arab tribes, and non-Arab converts, called mawali or clients, were attached to Arab tribal structures in ways that often felt like second-class membership in the community. The resentment this generated among Iranian Muslims was a significant factor in the Abbasid revolution of 750 CE, which overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate. The Abbasid movement drew heavily on Iranian support, and the new dynasty that emerged was, as mentioned, deeply shaped by Iranian cultural traditions. Under the Abbasids, with the capital at Baghdad, Iranian culture entered a period of extraordinary productivity. The Great Translation movement that would eventually transmit Greek philosophy to medieval Europe began here, with Iranian scholars translating Greek texts into Arabic, often via Syriac or Pahlavi intermediary versions. The intellectual tradition of Khosrow I's court, where Greek, Persian, and Indian learning had met, was now continued in an Islamic framework. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded in the early 9th century, became the greatest library and intellectual center in the world, and its staff was heavily Iranian. The scholar Abu Ja'far al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, was a Persian mathematician working in 9th century Baghdad who systematized algebra, which is itself an Arabic word derived from one of his book titles. Al-Razi, whom the Latin West knew as razors, was a Persian physician who wrote encyclopedic medical texts that remained standard references in European universities until the 17th century. Ibn Sina, whom the West knew as Avicenna, a name derived from a Latin mangling of his name, wrote the Canon of Medicine, a synthesis of Greek and Islamic medical knowledge that was used in European medical schools until at least 1650 CE. The sheer quantity of Iranian scholarly achievement in this period is staggering, and it occurred within and because of the Islamic cultural framework, not despite it. Poetry, which would become one of the supreme expressions of the Iranian spirit, was also beginning to develop in this period. The first Persian language poems that survive date from the early 9th century, showing a literary tradition that had maintained its oral vitality through the Arab conquest and was now finding new written form. The Persian language had survived. The Persian poetic genius was intact, and the stage was being set for one of the greatest flowerings of literary culture that any civilization has ever produced, the Samanids, Buyids, and the Persian Renaissance. By the 9th century CE, the Abbasid Caliphate, though still nominally supreme, was gradually losing real political control over the eastern provinces of its empire. The mechanisms were familiar. Governors sent from Baghdad to administer distant territories developed their own interests, their own armies, and their own dynastic ambitions. In the eastern provinces, particularly in Khorasan and Transoxiana, the territories that roughly correspond to northeastern Iran, western Afghanistan, and Central Asia, Iranian dynasties began to emerge that maintained nominal acknowledgement of the caliph's religious authority while exercising complete political independence. The Samanid dynasty, which ruled from 819 to 999 CE, centered on the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, represents the first full flowering of what historians call the Persian Renaissance. The Samanid rulers were Iranians of pre-Islamic noble lineage, devout Muslims who at the same time consciously promoted Persian language and culture as the vehicle of sophisticated expression. Their court at Bukhara became the cultural capital of the Eastern Islamic world, attracting poets, scholars, musicians, and thinkers from across the region. It was under Samanid patronage that Rudaki, often called the father of Persian poetry, composed his celebrated verses, creating what would become the classical Persian poetic tradition, and it was under the later Samanids and the successor Ghaznavid court that a man named Abul Qasim Ferdowsi began working on what would become the most important literary work in the Persian language. Ferdowsi spent roughly 30 years, from around 977 to 1010 CE, composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic poem of approximately 60,000 couplets that tells the entire mythological and semi-historical story of Iran from the creation of the world to the Arab conquest. The Shahnameh is not simply a poem, it is a national monument, an act of cultural preservation of almost heroic scale. Ferdowsi was determined that the Persian language and the Iranian epic tradition would survive, that the memory of Cyrus and Darius and Rustam and Sohrab and all the heroes and kings of Iran would not be dissolved into the Arabic cultural dominance of the Islamic world. The famous legend about Ferdowsi and the Ghaznavid Sultan Mahmud, whatever its historical accuracy, captures something true about the relationship between the poet and power. According to the tradition, Mahmud had promised Ferdowsi a gold coin for every couplet of the Shahnameh, but when the completed work was delivered, he paid in silver instead, a grievous insult. Ferdowsi responded by writing a ferocious satire of the Sultan and distributing it before fleeing to safety. The story may be embellished, but the underlying tension between the poet who understood the value of what he'd created and the ruler who failed to recognize it rings with a kind of eternal truth. The Shahnameh accomplished what Ferdowsi intended. It preserved the Persian language in a form so magnificent that subsequent centuries could not ignore it. The Persian language as used by Ferdowsi became the literary standard not only for Iran but for the entire Eastern Islamic world from Turkey to India. The Mughal emperors of India wrote Persian poetry. The Ottoman sultans maintained Persian-speaking poets at their courts. The Shahnameh itself was copied and illustrated in gorgeous manuscripts for 600 years, its stories becoming the visual vocabulary of Persian and Islamic art. When a Safavid Shah commissioned the finest illustrated manuscript of the Shahnameh in the 16th century, the result was one of the most beautiful books ever made. The philosopher and physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, also emerged from this Persian Renaissance context. Born in Bukhara in 980 CE, Ibn Sina produced in a lifetime of remarkable intellectual output works on medicine, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, geology, and psychology. His canon of medicine organized all of ancient and Islamic medical knowledge into a systematic encyclopedia that was used as a university textbook in Europe into the 17th century. His philosophical works engaged deeply with Aristotle and developed original arguments about the soul, consciousness, and the nature of existence. He was, in the estimation of many historians of philosophy, one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived. He was also, incidentally, a practicing physician who reportedly enjoyed wine and preferred not to discuss this publicly. He was human, in other words. The Buyid dynasty, which controlled much of Iran and Iraq from the 930s to the 1050s, was Shia Muslim and Iranian, which made for an interesting period when a Shia Iranian dynasty was effectively controlling the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. The Buyids kept the Caliph in position as a figurehead of religious legitimacy, while exercising all real political authority themselves. This arrangement, which must have been deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, nonetheless produced a remarkable period of cultural productivity. Baghdad under Buyid control remained a great intellectual centre, and the courts of the Iranian East continued to patronize science, philosophy, and poetry. The Persian Renaissance was not simply a cultural flowering, it was an assertion of identity. Iran had been conquered, but Iran had not been absorbed. The Persian language had survived, the Iranian epic tradition had been preserved, the Persian genius for administration, philosophy, and poetry was reasserting itself within the framework of Islam. The question going forward was whether this identity could survive the new waves of disruption that were already gathering on the horizon. Turks, Mongols, and the storms that kept coming. Iran's geographic position, at the intersection of the Central Asian steppes and the settled civilizations of the Middle East, meant that waves of nomadic peoples passed through, and sometimes settled in the Iranian territory, with a frequency that would have been exhausting to experience, and is merely tiring to summarize. The Seljuk Turks arrived from Central Asia in the early 11th century CE, defeating the Ghaznavid Sultan at the Battle of Dandanakan in 1036 CE. They were recent converts to Islam, Sunni and Orthodox, and their conquest of the Eastern Islamic world shifted power dramatically. By 1055, the Seljuk Sultan Tughril entered Baghdad and assumed the position of military protector of the Abbasid Caliph, taking the title Sultan while the Caliph retained his religious authority. The Seljuks then proceeded to defeat the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 CE, opening Anatolia to Turkish settlement and beginning the long process that would eventually produce the Ottoman Empire. For Iran, the Seljuk period was complex. The Seljuks were Turkish, not Iranian, but like so many conquerors before them, they found that governing Iran required Iranian administrative skills and Iranian cultural frameworks. The Seljuk court adopted Persian as its administrative language. Iranian ministers and bureaucrats ran the empire. The great Persian poet Omar Khayyam worked at the Seljuk court, writing mathematical treatises on the calculation of the calendar and the famous philosophical poems that Edward Fitzgerald would translate into English in the 19th century and make unexpectedly famous in Victorian England. There is something charming about the fact that a Persian mathematician-poet from 11th century Iran became enormously popular in Victorian England. Though Fitzgerald's translation is more Victorian than Persian in many ways, the Seljuk Empire eventually fragmented, as all large empires in this region tended to do, into competing sultanates. Iran in the 12th century was divided among several competing powers, with regional dynasties, Seljuk offshoots, and local rulers all contending for authority. This fragmentation, while politically chaotic, was culturally productive in the way that political fragmentation often is. Competing courts competed for poets and scholars, and the patronage of literature and architecture flourished across the region. Then came the Mongols, and with the Mongols came something that Iran had not experienced before, a wave of destruction on a scale that permanently altered the demographic and cultural landscape of the country. Genghis Khan's armies began their conquest of the Islamic Eastern world in 1219 CE. The first great city to fall was Otrar in Central Asia. Then came Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, Balkh. City after city was sacked with a thoroughness that contemporaries found impossible to comprehend. The historian Juvaini, writing in the generation after the conquests, describes cities that had been flourishing metropolitan centres reduced to fields of rubble, their populations massacred, their irrigation systems destroyed, their libraries burned. Merv, which may have been one of the largest cities in the world at the time of its destruction, never fully recovered. The demographic catastrophe of the Mongol conquests in Iran has been estimated at anywhere from 1/4 to 3/4 of the population, depending on the region and the methodology. Whatever the exact numbers, it was a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. And then something happened that is almost as interesting as the destruction itself. The Mongols, having destroyed so much, settled down and became Iranian. The Mongol Ilkhanate, the dynasty that ruled Iran from around 1256 to 1335 CE, began as conquerors and became, through the inevitable mechanisms of cultural absorption and practical governance, patrons of Iranian civilization. The Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam in 1295 CE, officially making the dynasty Muslim and giving it new legitimacy in the eyes of the population. Ghazan and his successors patronized Persian literature, Persian miniature painting, and Persian architecture with enormous enthusiasm. The Mongol period produced some of the finest examples of Persian manuscript illumination ever created, a supremely ironic outcome from a people who had burned so many manuscripts a generation earlier. The Ilkhanate collapsed in 1335 CE without a clear successor, leaving Iran fragmented again. Into this fragmentation came more waves of destruction. The campaigns of Timur, known in Europe as Tamerlane, in the 1390s CE, who sacked Isfahan and stacked towers of skulls outside the cities he conquered, which was his preferred form of architectural expression. Timur's conquests were another catastrophic interruption, though like the Mongol conquests, they were followed by a period of remarkable cultural productivity, as the Timurid dynasty he founded became some of the greatest patrons of art and learning in Islamic history. What is remarkable about Iran through all these storms, the Arab conquest, the Seljuk invasion, the Mongol catastrophe, the Timurid devastation, is not the destruction, but the recovery. Persian language survived every conquest. Persian poetry and philosophy continued to develop. The cultural memory embedded in the Shahnameh and in the living traditions of the Iranian people proved more durable than any political structure. Iran kept being beaten down and kept getting back up, carrying its identity with it, and this resilience in the face of apparently overwhelming catastrophe is one of the defining characteristics of Iranian civilization. The Safavid dynasty, Shia Islam, and a new Persian identity. In the early 16th century CE, something happened in Iran that would shape the country's identity for the next 500 years, and whose consequences are still visible in the tensions of today's Middle East. A young man of 14 named Ismail, leader of a Sufi religious order called the Safaviya, marched his fanatically devoted followers into Azerbaijan and conquered the city of Tabriz in 1501 CE. He declared himself Shah of Iran. He declared the Twelver Shia interpretation of Islam the official state religion, and he announced that anyone who disagreed could convert or face the consequences. The consequences were initially quite severe. Iran at the time was overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim. The Shia minority was concentrated mainly in certain cities and regions. The imposition of Shia Islam as the state religion was not simply a religious decision. It was a political masterstroke that created a distinct Iranian identity that separated the country from its Sunni Ottoman neighbours to the west, and its Sunni Uzbek neighbours to the east. In a world where religious identity and political identity were inseparable, making Iran officially Shia gave it an identity that was specifically Iranian, in a way it had not been since before the Arab conquest. The young Shah Ismail was also something extraordinary. He appears in history like a figure from the Shahnameh, possessed, burning with conviction, apparently fearless. His followers called him the shadow of God on earth, the reincarnation of Ali, the fourth caliph and son-in-law of the Prophet, the fulfillment of Shia eschatological hopes. They followed him with a devotion that blurred the line between military loyalty and religious ecstasy. His Kizilbash soldiers, the Redheads, named for their distinctive crimson turbans, charged into battle convinced that their Shah's divine protection made them invulnerable. This conviction met its limits at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 CE, where the Ottoman Sultan Selim I defeated Ismail's army with overwhelming numbers and, more significantly, with artillery and firearms that the Kizilbash cavalry had not encountered in such quantities before. The Safavids had guns, the Ottomans had more guns and used them more systematically. Chaldiran was a shattering defeat. Tabriz was briefly occupied. Ismail retreated. He reportedly never recovered psychologically from the defeat, spending his remaining years in grief and reportedly increasingly relying on wine, which was ironic for someone who had presented himself as the most perfect Muslim. But the Safavid dynasty survived Chaldiran and went on to create one of the most magnificent civilizations in Iranian history. The Shah who would bring it to its absolute peak was Abbas I, known as Abbas the Great, who came to power in 1588 CE and ruled until 1629 CE. Abbas was a practical genius. He recognized that the Safavid state had structural weaknesses. The Qizilbash tribal chiefs who had brought the dynasty to power had also become a constant source of instability, their loyalty conditional and their ambitions ungovernable. Abbas systematically reduced their power, building a new army based on converted Georgian, Armenian and Circassian slaves, Ghulam, who were personally loyal to the Shah rather than to tribal interests. He also recruited European advisors and military expertise, particularly through the English adventurers Robert and Anthony Shirley, who helped modernize the artillery. With this reorganized military, Abbas reconquered territories the Safavids had lost to the Ottomans and Uzbeks, recapturing Tabriz, taking back Khorasan, and securing the empire's borders. He then moved his capital from Kazvin to Isfahan, in the center of the plateau, and proceeded to build one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Isfahan under Abbas was a deliberate creation. The great Naqshi Jahan Square, still standing and still astonishing, is one of the largest public squares in the world, flanked by the Royal Mosque with its extraordinary blue-tiled dome, the Sheikh Lotfola Mosque, the Ali Kapu Palace Gate and the Bazaar Arcade. The proportions and the colour were calculated to express the perfection of God's creation and the majesty of the Shah who had ordered it built. European travellers arriving in Isfahan in the early 17th century were staggered. The Venetian merchants, the English diplomats, the French Jesuits who visited all wrote with something approaching disbelief about the scale and beauty of what they found. The Persian phrase that became famous across Europe summarised it simply, "Isfahan is half the world, Nisf-i Jahan." The Safavid court was a place of extraordinary cultural richness. Persian miniature painting reached its absolute peak in the 16th and 17th centuries under Safavid patronage, with artists like Reza Abazi creating works of extraordinary subtlety and beauty. Persian carpet production became a highly organised imperial industry, with court workshops producing pieces of such quality that they were sent as diplomatic gifts to Ottoman and European rulers and are now among the most prized objects in the world's museums. Persian poetry continued to flourish. Persian architecture in the Safavid mode, with its breathtaking tilework, its soaring vaulted halls, its gardens and water channels, became the visual language of a civilization at its most confident. The Safavid period also saw Iran develop its distinct Shia religious culture. The great Shia religious scholars, the ulama, gained increasing institutional authority and economic independence from the state. The pilgrimage cities of Mashhad in Iran and the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala in Iraq became the centers of Shia religious learning and emotional life. The morning rituals of Muharram, commemorating the martyrdom of Hussein ibn Ali at Karbala in 680 CE, developed into elaborate public performances that combined genuine religious devotion with theatrical elements of remarkable power. These rituals created a specifically Iranian Shia emotional landscape that is still central to the culture today. The tension between the Safavid religious establishment and the state was always present, and would eventually become critical. But during the height of Safavid power, the combination of Persian cultural identity and Shia religious identity created something that neither alone could have achieved. A specifically Iranian civilization that was simultaneously continuous with the ancient Persian past and distinctly Islamic, simultaneously Shia in its religious framework and Persian in its cultural expression, decline, invasion, and the long 18th century. The Safavid dynasty's decline followed the pattern that Iranian history had established as almost routine. Brilliant peak, gradual hollowing out of central authority, increasingly ineffective rulers, and then catastrophic external shock. The process was slow enough that contemporaries might not have recognized it as decline until it was too late to reverse. The later Safavid Shahs were, with some exceptions, not impressive figures. The court became increasingly dominated by the religious establishment and by the harem politics that surrounded weak rulers. The Qizilbash problem that Abbas had solved temporarily re-emerged in new forms. Tax revenues were spent on luxury rather than military modernization. The army that Abbas had built was not maintained at the level of capability he had established. By the early 18th century, the empire was visibly weakening. The Afghans, specifically the Ghilzai Pashtun Confederation from the eastern frontier, recognized the weakness before the Safavids did. In 1722 CE, an Afghan force under Mahmud Hotaki besieged Isfahan. The city held for several months, but eventually famine forced surrender. The last effective Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, surrendered in person, and Mahmud executed or imprisoned most of the royal family with systematic thoroughness. The Afghan occupation of Isfahan was brutal and chaotic. Mahmud himself appears to have descended into paranoia and cruelty before being killed by his own followers. His successor Ashraf managed the occupation somewhat more effectively, but faced challenges from all sides. The Ottomans invaded from the west, the Russians invaded from the north under Peter the Great, and a surviving Safavid prince named Tahmasp rallied resistance in the northeast. Into this chaos emerged one of the strangest and most interesting figures in Iranian history, Nader Kuli Beg, later known as Nader Shah. He started as a soldier of fortune in the service of the Safavid Prince Tahmasp, proved himself an extraordinarily gifted commander, drove out the Afghans, dealt with the Ottoman and Russian threats through diplomacy and force in roughly equal measure, and then deposed the Safavid Shah he had restored in 1736 CE and declared himself Shah of Iran. Nader Shah was a military genius of the First Order, and apparently a man of extremely difficult personality. His campaigns range from the Caucasus to Oman to Central Asia, but the most famous was his invasion of Mughal India in 1739 CE. The Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah, whose empire still nominally controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, had been sheltering Afghan refugees whom Nader considered his subjects. Nader demanded their extradition. The Mughals were slow to respond. Nader invaded. The decisive battle at Karnal in February 1739 left the Mughal army shattered. Nader occupied Delhi and triggered or failed to prevent a massacre of Delhi's population that killed perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 people in a single day. He then loaded up the wealth of the Mughal treasury and carried it back to Iran. The Peacock Throne, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, the Darya-i-Noor diamond, and so much gold and silver that Nader reportedly suspended Iranian taxation for 3 years on the proceeds. The Peacock Throne became the throne of Iranian Shahs, and the Darya-i-Noor diamond is still in the Iranian national treasury today. But Nader Shah's brilliance did not translate into stable rule. His later years were marked by increasing cruelty, paranoia, and erratic behavior, possibly the result of illness or the psychological effects of years of warfare. He was assassinated in 1747 CE by members of his own guard, and his empire fragmented almost immediately into the hands of his generals, the most successful of whom was Ahmad Khan Abdali, who founded the Durrani Afghan dynasty and the state that would eventually become Afghanistan. Iran entered a period of renewed fragmentation and civil war among competing regional powers. The Zand dynasty, founded by Karim Khan Zand, brought a degree of stability to much of the country in the second half of the 18th century, with its capital at Shiraz. Karim Khan, who interestingly refused the title of Shah and called himself instead Vakil, regent of the people, is remembered in Iranian tradition as an unusually benevolent ruler who reduced taxes, encouraged trade, and reportedly preferred the company of commoners to courtiers. His tomb in Shiraz is still visited as a place of affection rather than mere historical interest. After Karim Khan's death in 1779 CE, civil war resumed and was eventually resolved by the Qajar tribe from northern Iran, whose leader Aga Muhammad Khan united the country through a campaign of such extraordinary violence that his enemies sometimes surrendered simply from the psychological impact of his reputation. He was crowned Shah in 1796 CE and established the Qajar dynasty that would rule Iran until 1925 CE. He was murdered the following year by his own servants, which seems to have surprised no one very much. The Qajar dynasty and the first brush with modernity. The Qajar dynasty inherited an Iran that was exhausted by nearly a century of warfare and political instability, geographically still coherent but institutionally very weak. What it then proceeded to do, through a combination of strategic incompetence, insufficient military modernization, and the simple misfortune of being located between two rapidly expanding empires, was to preside over the largest territorial losses in Iranian history. The two empires in question were Russia to the north and Britain to the south and east. Russia was engaged in the systematic expansion of its Caucasian territories, which had been under nominal Iranian suzerainty. Two Russo-Persian wars, the first ending in 1813 CE with the Treaty of Gulistan, and the second ending in 1828 CE with the Treaty of Turkmenchay, stripped Iran of the entire Caucasus region. Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Dagestan, territories that had been part of the Iranian cultural and political world for centuries. The indemnity imposed after the Second War nearly bankrupted the Qajar state. Britain, meanwhile, was protecting its Indian Empire and its path to it from potential Russian encroachment, which meant treating Iran as a buffer state to be managed and occasionally threatened. The British and Russians together developed what became known as the Great Game, the competition for influence in Central Asia, and Iran was one of the main prizes to be managed rather than respected. Iranian territory further shrank as British pressure forced the recognition of Afghan independence and the cession of Herat. The Qajar response to these pressures was inadequate in almost every dimension. The army was not modernized effectively. The state revenues, largely dependent on customs duties and land taxes, were insufficient. Foreign loans were taken out under terms that gave lenders concessions over Iranian resources and sovereignty. British and Russian advisors and concession holders accumulated influence that Iranian officials and people increasingly resented. It was in this context that the tobacco protest of 1891 to 1892 CE occurred, an event that deserves to be better known than it is because it was genuinely remarkable. The Qajar Shah Nasser al-Din had granted a British company, the Imperial Tobacco Corporation, a complete monopoly over the production, sale, and export of Iranian tobacco. This was an astounding concession that threatened the livelihoods of Iranian farmers, merchants, and shopkeepers throughout the country. The leading Shia cleric of the time, Mirza Hassan Shirazi, issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, declaring that the use of tobacco was forbidden as long as the concession remained in force. The effect was immediate and startling. Throughout Iran, pipes were put away and hookahs were extinguished. Even in the royal harem, the Shah's wives reportedly refused to smoke. The mass compliance with a clerical ruling against a government policy demonstrated for the first time the political power of the Shia religious establishment when it chose to mobilize public opinion against the state. The Shah was forced to cancel the concession within a few months, paying a substantial compensation to the British company in the process. The tobacco protest established a template for religious political activism in Iran that would repeat itself with steadily increasing force over the following century. The constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1911 CE was a more sustained and ultimately more ambiguous episode. Inspired by events in Russia, Japan, and the Ottoman Empire, Iranian reformers, merchants, clergy, and intellectuals united in demanding a constitution that would limit royal power, establish a parliament, and subject government to the rule of law. After extended protests, the Qajar Shah Muzaffar al-Din signed the constitution in late 1906 CE, and Iran's first elected parliament, the Majlis, convened in 1907 CE. Iran became, in principle, the first constitutional monarchy in the Middle East. In practice, the constitutional revolution was quickly complicated by foreign intervention and domestic divisions. Russia and Britain divided Iran into spheres of influence in a secret agreement in 1907 CE, with Russia controlling the north and Britain the south, treating the constitutional government as an inconvenient obstacle rather than a sovereign partner. The successor, Shah Muhammad Ali, who disliked the whole constitutional project intensely, bombarded the parliament with Russian Cossack forces in 1908 CE and attempted to restore absolute rule. A popular uprising restored the constitution the following year. But the parliamentary government that emerged was weak, fractured, and operating under the humiliating pressure of foreign powers who felt entitled to dictate Iranian policy. World War I brought further catastrophe. Iran declared neutrality, but its territory was used by Russian, British, and Ottoman forces regardless. Famine killed perhaps 1/4 of the Iranian population in some estimates, as foreign armies requisitioned food, disrupted trade, and the government was too weak to protect its own people. By the end of the war, Iran was in a state of effective collapse, and the Qajar dynasty, which had never been particularly popular, had accumulated grievances that it would not survive. Reza Shah and the modernization of Iran, the figure who would take advantage of Iran's post-war weakness and transform the country in ways both necessary and brutal, was a soldier named Reza Khan, a commanding officer of the Cossack Brigade, the only functional military unit in the country. who had worked his way up from obscurity through a combination of physical presence, military competence, and political instinct. In February 1921 CE, Reza Khan marched on Tehran with his Cossack forces, occupied the capital without significant resistance, and effectively took control of the government. He worked initially as Minister of War and then Prime Minister under a nominal Qajar Shah, systematically consolidating military and political power while deciding what to do with the throne. He briefly considered declaring Iran a republic in the manner of the Turkish nationalist revolution happening across the border under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, but the opposition of the Shia clergy to a republic convinced him to take a different path. In 1925 CE, the Majlis deposed the last Qajar Shah and crowned Reza Khan as Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of the new Pahlavi dynasty. The name Pahlavi was not an accident. Pahlavi was the name of the Middle Persian language, the language of the Sasanian Empire. By choosing it, Reza Shah was making a statement about his vision for Iran, a return to the pre-Islamic Persian heritage, a connection with the greatness of the Achaemenids and Sasanians that would provide the ideological foundation for modern Iranian nationalism. This was a conscious and politically freighted choice that would have significant consequences over the following decades. Reza Shah's modernization program was modeled loosely on Ataturk's Turkey, though it had distinct Iranian characteristics. He built a national army answerable to the state rather than to tribal or regional commanders. He extended the railway network across the country, with the Trans-Iranian Railway, connecting the Caspian coast in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south, a genuine engineering achievement that transformed economic geography. He established a modern court system, reducing the jurisdiction of religious courts. He built modern schools and, crucially, a university in Tehran. He sent Iranian students abroad to study, particularly to Europe. The social reforms were dramatic and often coercive. In 1936 CE, Reza Shah issued a decree banning the veil for women, ordering police to physically remove head coverings from women who wore them in public. This policy, however well-intentioned by its architects, was experienced by many religiously conservative Iranian women as a violent imposition, one that required them to choose between leaving their homes unveiled, which many found spiritually intolerable, or staying home, which they had not done. The policy created resistance and resentment that would surface decades later in ways no one then could have anticipated. Reza Shah also centralized power with a thoroughness that brooked little opposition. The tribal confederacies that had been features of Iranian society for millennia were suppressed, their leaders killed or exiled, their populations forcibly settled. The press was controlled. Political parties were banned. The males continued to exist, but as a rubber stamp rather than a deliberative body. The Soviet and British spheres of influence were pushed back as Reza Shah renegotiated foreign concessions and asserted national sovereignty. Then came World War II. Reza Shah had been moving cautiously toward Germany in the 1930s, attracted by German technical expertise and by the German opposition to both Britain and the Soviet Union. He declared Iran neutral when war broke out in 1939 CE. The British and Soviets, however, needed Iranian territory for the supply route to the Soviet Union and were not interested in Iranian neutrality. In August 1941 CE, Soviet and British forces invaded Iran simultaneously and occupied the country within days, meeting minimal resistance. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate in favour of his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza, and was sent into exile, where he died in South Africa in 1944 CE. The forced abdication of Reza Shah was a humiliation for Iranian sovereignty that is still felt in the cultural memory. A king who had spent 20 years asserting Iranian independence from foreign interference was removed from his throne by the same foreign powers who had interfered in Iranian affairs for a century. For many Iranians, it confirmed a dark suspicion that Iran's fate was ultimately decided in London and Moscow, not in Tehran. The young Mohammad Reza Shah, who replaced him, would spend the next 38 years in an increasingly desperate attempt to break free of this suspicion, while simultaneously depending on foreign support in ways that made the suspicion seem justified. Oil, the Cold War, and Mohammad Mossadegh oil had been discovered in commercial quantities in Iran in 1908 CE, and the British had been extracting it under the terms of the Darcy Concession, and its successor, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, ever since. The terms of this arrangement were deeply disadvantageous to Iran. The company paid Iran a royalty that was far smaller than the profits it took, kept its accounts secret, and operated as a state within a state in the oil-rich province of Khuzestan, with its own police, housing and infrastructure for British employees, while Iranian workers lived in demonstrably inferior conditions. The resentment this generated crossed all political lines in Iran. Nationalists resented the foreign control of what was clearly the country's most valuable resource. Communists, organised in the Tudeh party, resented the exploitation of Iranian labour. Shia clerics resented the presence of a foreign non-Muslim company operating with such autonomy in Iranian territory. The only people who did not particularly resent it were a small number of Iranians who personally benefited from the arrangement, and some of them resented it too. Into this environment came Mohammad Mossadegh. He was an unusual figure in Iranian politics, an aristocrat of genuine democratic conviction, an elderly man of notable physical frailty who wept in public on occasions of political importance, and who possessed a wit and an intelligence that were matched by a political courage that was almost reckless. He had been a prominent figure in Iranian politics since the Constitutional Revolution, and had opposed Reza Shah's autocracy. By the late 1940s, he was the most popular politician in Iran. Mossadegh's central proposition was simple. Iran should nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The oil was Iranian. The revenues should go to Iran. The British had no right to the profits they were extracting. This was the argument, and to an overwhelming majority of Iranians, it was obviously correct. The National Front, the political coalition Mossadegh led, won a majority in the Majlis, and in April 1951 CE, the Majlis voted to nationalize the oil industry. The Shah, under enormous popular pressure, appointed Mossadegh as Prime Minister. On May 1, 1951 CE, Mossadegh formally nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He had the locks changed at the company's facilities and replaced the British flag with the Iranian one. The British response was furious and somewhat panicked. They withdrew their technical personnel, organised an international boycott of Iranian oil, froze Iranian assets, and began planning for the removal of Mossadegh. They appealed to the Americans for help, framing the situation not as a dispute over oil revenues, but as a threat of communist takeover. This was partly strategic framing and partly genuine anxiety. The Tudeh party, with its Soviet connections, was active in Iran, and the Cold War had made American policymakers extremely sensitive to anything that looked like potential communist advance. The Eisenhower administration was persuadable. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan Dulles, the CIA director, were convinced that Mossadegh's nationalization threatened not only British oil profits, but the entire Western position in the Cold War. In August 1953 CE, the CIA and British intelligence together organized a coup, codenamed Operation Ajax by the Americans and Operation Boot by the British. The coup worked. Street thugs were paid to stage violent demonstrations. Military officers loyal to the Shah were organized. On August 19, 1953 CE, Mossadegh was overthrown, arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to house arrest, where he would remain until his death in 1967 CE. Mohammad Reza Shah, who had briefly fled the country when the coup seemed uncertain, returned to Iran and resumed his throne, now firmly under American protection. The 1953 coup is one of those historical events whose consequences ripple forward in time in ways that none of its architects intended. The Americans thought they were protecting Western interests in the Cold War and preventing a potential communist takeover of Iran. What they actually did was establish in the Iranian political consciousness, across all political tendencies from left to right, religious to secular, an enduring conviction that Iran's fate was decided by foreign powers and that any Iranian leader who genuinely threatened Western interest would be removed. This conviction was not paranoia. It was based on direct experience, and it created a political environment in which distrust of the United States, and by extension the Shah, who had been restored by American action, was rational rather than hysterical. The Shah understood what had happened, which made his position psychologically complicated. He had been returned to his throne by the Americans and the British, but he wanted to be an independent, modernizing ruler in the tradition of Reza Shah. He needed American support but resented the dependency it implied. He cracked down on domestic opposition, not only communists but all independent political organization, in ways that gradually eliminated the space for legitimate political expression and drove opposition underground. For the next 25 years, Iranian oil revenues flowed into the state, and the Shah used them with genuine ambition. But the political price of American protection, was a constraint on Iranian sovereignty that would eventually prove impossible to sustain. The White Revolution and the road to 1979. The Shah launched what he called the White Revolution in 1962 to 1963 CE, a series of reforms that included land redistribution from large landowners to peasants, the extension of voting rights to women, nationalization of forests, creation of a literacy corps to bring education to rural areas, and profit sharing for industrial workers. These were genuinely substantial reforms that transformed Iranian society in important ways. The large landlord class that had dominated rural Iran was broken up. Millions of peasants became landowners. Women voted for the first time. Literacy rates climbed. But the reforms were launched from above by an autocratic government without meaningful democratic input, and they created as many problems as they solved. The land redistribution disrupted traditional agricultural patterns without always providing the technical support and capital that new smallholders needed to succeed. Many former peasants eventually drifted to the cities, swelling the shanty towns around Tehran and other urban centres, with a population that had been uprooted from traditional life without being fully incorporated into modern industrial society. This urban poor would become one of the core constituencies of the revolution. The White Revolution also directly challenged the power and interests of the Shia clergy in several ways. The land redistribution affected religious endowments, waqf, which had traditionally been a major source of clerical income. The extension of voting rights to women was opposed by conservative clerics on religious grounds. The literacy corps, by sending young urban men and women into rural areas, was seen as an intrusion into a social world traditionally governed by religious authority. It was in this context that a previously obscure cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini emerged as a vocal critic of the Shah. In June 1963 CE, Khomeini delivered a speech in the city of Qum attacking the Shah, comparing him to the despised Umayyad tyrant Yazid, accusing the government of capitulating to Israel and the United States. He was arrested, and his arrest triggered violent protests in which an uncertain number of people, dozens or hundreds or perhaps more, were killed by government forces. Khomeini was eventually sent into exile, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, then to France. He spent the next 16 years outside Iran. But he did not go quiet. The 1960s and 70s in Iran were a period of enormous economic growth and equally enormous political repression. Oil revenues funded rapid industrialization. Tehran grew from a modest city of a few 100,000 to a sprawling metropolis of 5 million. The middle class expanded. Universities multiplied. Women entered the professional workforce in large numbers. By the mid-1970s, Iran had one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. But the political system could not accommodate the society it was creating. The Shah's secret police, Savak, monitored, arrested, tortured, and disappeared opponents with sufficient thoroughness to eliminate organized opposition, while simultaneously generating deep and widespread hatred. The educated middle class that the Shah's modernization policies had created was politically frustrated by a system that offered economic opportunity, but no political voice. The urban poor who had migrated from the countryside in search of economic opportunity found themselves in a society that was modernizing in ways that felt alien to their religious and cultural identities. The clergy, who had been marginalized by the Pahlavi state's secular nationalism, continued to provide the moral and organizational framework that the secular state had tried to replace without succeeding. There is a certain tragedy in the late Pahlavi period, which is that the Shah seems to have genuinely believed that economic modernization and increasing prosperity would resolve the political tensions. He did not understand, or would not acknowledge, that people will accept poverty more readily than humiliation, and that a society denied political participation will eventually express itself through the only channel available: explosion. The first serious warning came in the autumn of 1977 CE, when a combination of economic slowdown, political liberalization signals from the newly inaugurated Carter administration in the United States, which emphasized human rights, and decades of accumulated resentment combined to produce the first organized street protests. The protests grew through 1978 CE. They were fired by a confluence of social forces that had never previously aligned: secular intellectuals, leftist students, the urban poor, the traditional Bazari merchant class, and the religious establishment led by Khomeini, now issuing statements from Paris that were recorded on cassette tapes and smuggled into Iran for distribution in mosques. The Shah's response oscillated between conciliation and repression, without committing fully to either. He offered reforms and then cracked down. He replaced prime ministers. He made speeches promising democratization, while his security forces continued to kill protesters. This inconsistency, which may have reflected genuine uncertainty, or a man who was seriously ill, he had been diagnosed with cancer in 1973, though few knew it, made him appear simultaneously ruthless and weak, which was the worst possible combination. On January 16, 1979 CE, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi departed Iran for what was officially described as a vacation. He never returned. He died in Egypt in 1980 CE, the second Pahlavi Shah to end his life in exile. The Islamic Revolution. The departure of the Shah did not mean the revolution was complete. It meant the revolution had won its first battle and now had to decide what it was. And what it was, it turned out, was something that surprised almost everyone involved, including many of those who'd fought for it. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran on February 1, 1979 CE, to a welcome of several million people in the streets of Tehran. It was one of the most extraordinary scenes of the 20th century. An elderly cleric who had spent 15 years in exile, who had communicated through cassette tapes and pamphlets, who had never held government office, and whose political theory was barely known to most of the people celebrating his return, arriving to be received as the unchallenged leader of a nation of 37 million people. The revolution that had swept away the Shah had not been Khomeini's revolution alone. It had been a coalition revolution, secular intellectuals, Marxist guerrillas, liberal nationalists who imagined they were creating something like the democracy Mossadegh had tried to build, religious conservatives who wanted Islamic law, merchants who wanted an end to cronyism, workers who wanted labour rights, students who wanted everything simultaneously. Khomeini had been the symbolic centre that united this coalition, but the coalition was not unified behind any specific post-revolutionary programme. What happened in the following months was the gradual and then rapid consolidation of power by the Khomeini faction and its vision of an Islamic republic governed by the doctrine of Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist. This was Khomeini's political innovation, the idea that in the absence of the hidden imam, the infallible religious leader whose return Shia Muslims awaited, authority should be exercised by the most qualified Islamic jurist. In practical terms, this meant Khomeini himself, and later a supreme leader chosen by an assembly of experts. The secular and leftist factions who had participated in the revolution found themselves progressively marginalized, then suppressed, then in many cases killed. The liberal nationalists of the Freedom Movement and the National Front attempted to work within the new system, but found the Islamic Republic increasingly intolerant of genuine pluralism. The Marxist Fedayeen and Mujahideen guerrilla groups, which had fought against the Shah, turned against the Islamic Republic and were met with mass executions. By the early 1980s, the revolution had consumed many of its own children. For ordinary Iranians, the revolution brought changes that were profound and often disorienting. The Islamic Republic imposed dress codes. Women were required to wear the hijab in public. Alcohol was banned. Western music was restricted. The legal system was reformed along Islamic lines. Mixed-gender public spaces were regulated. The universities were briefly closed for a cultural revolution intended to Islamicize the curriculum. But the revolution also brought things that were genuinely popular. The nationalization of foreign-owned enterprises, the elimination of the Pahlavi court's corruption, a rhetorical commitment to the poor and dispossessed that resonated deeply with those who had lived in the shantytowns. The revolution had a populist energy that was not simply manufactured by clerical manipulation. Millions of Iranians genuinely believed in it, genuinely supported the Islamic Republic, genuinely found in Khomeini a figure who embodied their deepest convictions about religion, national dignity and social justice. This is a fact that is sometimes lost in Western accounts of the revolution, which tend to focus on its authoritarian dimensions while missing the genuine popular mobilization that made it possible. The relationship between the new Islamic Republic and the United States, already defined by the memory of 1953, was catastrophically damaged by the hostage crisis. In November 1979 CE, a group of student followers of Khomeini's line stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage. They held them for 444 days, a period that consumed the Carter administration, humiliated the United States in ways that still reverberate in American foreign policy, and consolidated Khomeini's domestic position by defining the revolution against an external enemy. The hostages were released in January 1981 CE, precisely as Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, a timing that has generated conspiracy theories ever since. What is not in dispute is that the hostage crisis permanently poisoned Iranian-American relations in ways that shaped the subsequent 40 years of history. The Iran-Iraq War. 8 years of fire. If the revolution was the defining event of 1979, the Iran-Iraq War was the defining event of the entire decade of the 1980s, and its consequences were even more lasting. The war lasted from September 1980 CE to August 1988 CE, cost somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Iranian lives, and a comparable number of Iraqi lives, and shaped everything about Iranian society, politics, culture and foreign policy for a generation. Why? Saddam Hussein launched the invasion of Iran on September 22, 1980 CE, with the specific calculations of an opportunist who believed the Islamic Republic was vulnerable. The revolution had purged the officer corps of the Iranian military. Iran was diplomatically isolated following the hostage crisis. The country was in internal political turmoil. The Arab-speaking population of Khuzestan, where Iran's oil fields were concentrated, might support an Iraqi advance. Saddam expected a quick victory, perhaps a matter of weeks. He was catastrophically wrong. The initial Iraqi advance captured territory in Khuzestan, including the city of Khorramshahr, but Iranian resistance, though disorganized, was ferocious. The revolutionary mobilization of the country produced something that professional military analysis had not anticipated. Millions of Iranians, many of them young men with minimal military training, volunteered to defend their country and their revolution. The Basij, the volunteer militia organized by the Revolutionary Guards, became the characteristic force of the Iranian war effort. Ideologically motivated, often poorly equipped, willing to sustain casualties that professional armies would not have accepted. The war settled into the pattern of the First World War in miniature. Trench lines, artillery exchanges, gas attacks by the Iraqis who used chemical weapons with devastating effect on Iranian troops, and periodic offensives that gained or lost ground in bloody increments. The fighting around Khorramshahr, which was retaken by Iran in May 1982 CE, was so brutal that Iranians called it the City of Blood. The fighting around the Fao Peninsula in 1986 CE and 1988 CE demonstrated that neither side could achieve decisive victory. The human waves of Iranian attackers, often composed of teenagers who had been told that martyrdom in defense of Islam would guarantee paradise, are one of the most disturbing images of the war. The systematic use of barely trained volunteers as infantry against well-armed Iraqi positions was an extraordinarily costly tactic, and the graves of those who died fill cemeteries across Iran that are still visited by families 4 decades later. The Shaheed, the martyr, became the central figure of Islamic Republican identity, the person who had given everything for faith and nation. The international dimension of the war revealed the depth of Iranian isolation. The United States and most Western countries supported Iraq, providing intelligence, economic assistance, and later, diplomatic cover for Iraq's use of chemical weapons. The Soviet Union sold arms to both sides. The Gulf Arab states, frightened by the Islamic Republic's revolutionary rhetoric about exporting the revolution, funded Iraq with billions of dollars. Iran found itself fighting not just Iraq, but a coalition of its enemies. The war ended in August 1988 CE when Khomeini, in a statement he compared to drinking poison, accepted a United Nations ceasefire. Iran had not achieved the overthrow of Saddam that it had been demanding as a condition for peace. The borders returned roughly to where they had been before the war. Several 100,000 Iranians were dead. The economy was devastated. The country was exhausted. Khomeini died in June 1989 CE, less than a year after the ceasefire. His funeral drew perhaps 10 million people into the streets of Tehran. The crowds were so overwhelming that his coffin was nearly destroyed as mourners tried to touch it. He had been the defining figure of the revolution, of the war, of the Islamic Republic. His successor as supreme leader was Ali Khamenei, a mid-ranking cleric who had been president, and whose elevation over more senior clerics was controversial among the religious establishment. The question of what the Islamic Republic would become without its founder was one that Iran would spend the following decades attempting to answer. The Islamic Republic, life inside the revolution. The years after the war's end and Khomeini's death were years of reconstruction, adjustment, and gradual evolution in ways that no simple narrative entirely captures. The Islamic Republic was not a monolithic entity. It contained within itself genuine political tensions that expressed themselves, albeit in constrained forms, through elections, parliamentary debates, factional struggles, and the periodic flowering of reformist movements. The presidency of Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani from 1989 to 1997, CE focused on economic reconstruction after the devastation of the war. The economy was rebuilt, some privatization occurred, and the pragmatic wing of the Islamic Republic, those who prioritized economic development and normalized relations with the world over ideological purity, had their period of influence. The election of Muhammad Khatami as president in 1997 CE was a genuine political surprise. Khatami, a mid-ranking cleric with an intellectual and reformist orientation, won by a landslide on a platform of civil society, rule of law, and dialogue among civilizations. The youth of Iran, born after the revolution, and forming the majority of the population, voted for him overwhelmingly. His election seemed to promise a different Islamic Republic, one that could be both Islamic and pluralistic, both revolutionary in its origins and democratic in its practice. The Khatami years were a period of extraordinary cultural vitality. The Iranian cinema that had been developing since the revolution, constrained by censorship but also paradoxically freed by those constraints to develop a distinctive aesthetic of suggestion and implication, gained international recognition. Directors like Abbas Kiarostami and Mohsen Makhmalbaf made films that won major awards at international festivals and introduced the world to an Iran it had not expected. Contemplative, intelligent, humane, struggling with questions about truth and illusion, childhood and authority that resonated far beyond their specific cultural context. Literature and poetry flourished, sometimes within censorship and sometimes around it. The Persian internet became a significant medium for expression, and Iranian bloggers were among the most numerous per capita in the world in the early 2000s, creating a digital public sphere that the authorities struggled to control. But Khatami's political project was blocked by the conservative establishment. The Guardian Council, the appointed body that vets legislation and candidates for its compatibility with Islamic law, disqualified reformist candidates and struck down reformist legislation. Newspapers were closed. Student protests were suppressed. The reformists kept winning elections and being prevented from governing effectively. By the end of Khatami's second term, many of his supporters were disillusioned, concluding that change within the Islamic Republic's framework was impossible. Daily life in the Islamic Republic was more complex and more human than the image of uniformed revolutionaries and chanting crowds suggests. Iranian society maintained its love of poetry, its cultivation of personal relationships, its passion for football, its characteristic combination of public piety and private license. The gap between public performance of Islamic norms and private life was a feature of Iranian society that most Iranians navigated with practiced ease. Young people found ways around the restrictions on music, socializing, and personal behavior that were sometimes elaborate and sometimes simply a matter of knowing which neighborhood cafes and parties operated with which degree of official tolerance. The Iranian middle class, expanded enormously by the education system that had been one of the Islamic Republic's genuine achievements, was a restless, educated, increasingly connected to the world's social force. Satellite television, banned but widely used through dishes that appeared on rooftops like a technological protest movement. The internet, filtered but extensively navigated around. Millions of Iranian Americans and Iranians in Europe maintaining connections to family and culture. Iran was not the closed society that its official image sometimes suggested. Iran and the world, nuclear programs, sanctions, and isolation. The 21st century opened for Iran with a series of events that both created opportunities for change and ultimately foreclosed them. The September 11th attacks in 2001 CEE initially seemed to offer a strange opening. Iran had genuine strategic conflicts with both the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the two regimes the United States proceeded to dismantle in 2001 and 2003 CE respectively. Iranian diplomats reportedly provided meaningful assistance to the American intervention in Afghanistan. There were quiet suggestions of possible broader cooperation. President George W. Bush's inclusion of Iran in the axis of evil in his January 2002 CE State of the Union address ended these possibilities. From the Iranian perspective, a country that had just cooperated with the United States against a common enemy had been publicly branded in terms borrowed from Nazi Germany. The reformists who had been carefully exploring possibilities for improved relations were discredited. The conservatives who had always argued that the United States was irredeemably hostile were vindicated, and the window of opportunity closed. The nuclear program became the defining international issue of the following decade and a half. Iran had been developing nuclear technology since the Shah's era, with American assistance initially, since the Shah had wanted nuclear power for energy purposes. The Islamic Republic had continued and expanded the program. In 2002 CE, an Iranian opposition group revealed the existence of previously undisclosed nuclear facilities at Natanz in Iraq. The revelation triggered an international crisis that would not be fully resolved until the nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was signed in 2015 CE. Whether Iran was pursuing nuclear weapons, as Western governments insisted, or only peaceful nuclear energy with uranium enrichment, as Iran insisted it was entitled to under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, was a question that generated more heat than light in public debate. The technical reality was that enriching uranium for fuel and enriching uranium toward weapons-grade material use the same centrifuge technology, so the distinction between a civilian program and a weapons program is at a certain level of enrichment a matter of degree and time rather than kind. Iran enriched uranium to levels well below weapons grade, but maintained the capability to enrich further if it chose. The international pressure campaign against Iran's nuclear program produced steadily escalating sanctions that by the early 2010s had severely damaged the Iranian economy. Oil exports fell dramatically. The Iranian rial lost most of its value. Inflation soared. The middle class that had been expanding under Rafsanjani and Khatami was squeezed, their purchasing power eroded, and their access to imported goods cut off. The Green Movement of 2009 CE was the most significant internal political challenge the Islamic Republic had faced since the consolidation of power in the early 1980s. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the populist conservative who had been elected president in 2005 CE, and who had made Iran a much more confrontational presence in international diplomacy, was re-elected in June 2009 CE in results that millions of Iranians and most international observers believed had been fraudulently manipulated. The reformist candidates Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi called their supporters into the streets. For several weeks, Iran experienced the largest political protests since the revolution. Millions marched in green, the colour of the reform movement, through the streets of Tehran and other cities. "Where is my vote?" became the slogan of a movement that was not simply about the election results, but about the accumulated frustration of a generation that had expected the Islamic Republic to evolve toward greater openness and had found itself repeatedly blocked. The crackdown was brutal. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested. The movement's leaders were placed under house arrest where they remain to this day. The reformist political project was effectively ended. Many of those who had been most engaged in trying to change Iran from within concluded, as a second generation had after the Khatami years, that the system would not reform itself. The nuclear deal of 2015 CE, negotiated between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, offered a prospect of economic normalization in exchange for constraints on Iran's nuclear program. The deal was deeply controversial in the United States and in Iran, but it represented a genuine diplomatic achievement that temporarily eased international tensions and began the process of sanctions relief. Its effective end came in May 2018 CE when President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement and reimposed sanctions, a decision that from the Iranian perspective confirmed what the most cynical voices had always said, that agreements with the United States were not reliable instruments of policy. The subsequent reimposition of crushing sanctions, the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020 CE, and the spiraling tensions in the Gulf created a regional environment of sustained crisis. Internally, the protests of 2019 to 2020 CE and the even more significant uprising of 2022 CE, sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, a young Kurdish Iranian woman who died in the custody of the morality police after being detained for allegedly improper hijab, demonstrated that Iranian society continued to generate challenges to the Islamic Republic from within, particularly from women and from the young. The woman, life, freedom movement, Jinjian Azadi in Kurdish, brought millions into the streets across every region of the country. The subsequent repression was severe, but the underlying social forces that produced the protest did not disappear. Iran in the 21st century is a country navigating extraordinary tensions between its desire for international respect and its isolation, between the revolutionary generation that built the Islamic Republic and the post-revolutionary generations that grew up inside it, between genuine religious conviction and the social diversification of a highly educated urban society, between a strategic position that gives it significant regional power and a governance structure that limits its ability to translate that power into prosperity. The legacy of Iran, the empire the world forgot. We have travelled a long way tonight, from the first farmers on the Iranian plateau 10,000 years ago to the protests in the streets of Tehran in the 21st century, from Cyrus the Great receiving the submission of Babylon to Masadi, weeping at the rostrum of the United Nations, from the fire temples of the Sasanians to the nuclear facilities at Natanz. The journey has been long, and it has not been a simple story of uninterrupted greatness. It has been a story of rise and fall and rise again, of conquest and survival, of a civilization that has been broken repeatedly and has kept on reassembling itself. What does Iran's history reveal that is worth sitting with on a quiet evening like this? The first thing is the sheer depth of time. Iran is not a young nation attempting to establish its identity. It is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth, and the weight of that antiquity sits in the culture in ways that are sometimes difficult for outsiders to perceive, but that are always present. When Iranian politicians invoke the memory of Cyrus or the glory of the Safavids, they are not making arbitrary historical references. They are drawing on a living tradition of self-understanding that shapes how millions of people think about who they are and what their country means. The second thing is the remarkable fact of cultural survival. Iran has been conquered more times than most countries can claim, by Greeks, by Arabs, by Turks, by Mongols, by Afghans, by Russians, by British, and the culture has survived every conquest. Not unchanged, because cultures that survive do so by adapting, but recognizably continuous. The Persian language is still spoken, Persian poetry is still recited. Nowruz, the Persian New Year celebrated at the spring equinox, a tradition that predates Islam and may predate written history, is still the most important festival of the Iranian calendar. The gardens are still planted with intention, the pomegranates are still abundant. The third thing is the complexity of Iran's relationship with Islam. Iran is a Muslim country. The Iranian people are overwhelmingly Muslim, and the Shia tradition has shaped Iranian identity in profound ways. But Iran is also a country with a pre-Islamic heritage of immense richness that has never been entirely subsumed into Islamic identity. The conversation between Iranian identity and Islamic identity has been one of the most generative tensions in human cultural history, producing philosophy, poetry, art, and architecture of extraordinary quality. The fact that this conversation sometimes turns contentious, as it has in the modern period, does not diminish the richness of what it has produced over 14 centuries. The fourth thing is the tragedy of Iranian potential. A country of 85 million people, with one of the highest rates of university education in the world, a sophisticated urban culture, an ancient tradition of scientific and philosophical achievement, an extraordinarily rich artistic and literary heritage, and one of the largest natural resource endowments on Earth, should be among the most prosperous and influential countries in the world. That it is instead diplomatically isolated, economically strangled by sanctions, and internally divided by a governance structure that cannot fully accommodate the society it governs, is a tragedy by any measure, and one that affects not only Iranians but everyone who might benefit from what a fully flourishing Iran could contribute. The Persian gift to humanity is enormous and largely unacknowledged. The word paradise comes from Persian. The idea of a universal empire that respects the dignity and culture of all its subject peoples, however imperfectly realized by the Achaemenids, was a contribution to political philosophy that the world is still working out how to implement. The poetry of Hafez and Rumi, which circulates now in hundreds of millions of copies in dozens of translations across the world, often without people knowing it comes from Iran, is not merely beautiful language. It is a way of understanding the human experience of love, loss, divine longing, and the comedy of existence that has proven capable of speaking to people across every cultural boundary. Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, translated by Fitzgerald in 1859 CE, became a sensation in the English-speaking world precisely because its meditation on mortality, pleasure, and the incomprehensibility of existence touched something universal. Rumi, whose Masnavi is often called the Quran of the Persian language by those who love it, speaks across 9 centuries with the directness about the soul's longing for union that makes him the best-selling poet in the United States in certain recent years, which is not something many medieval Persian mystics can claim. The Persian carpet, which anyone who has sat in a comfortable room will have encountered without necessarily knowing what they were looking at, is one of the supreme achievements of human decorative art. The mathematical sophistication of its patterns, the botanical knowledge encoded in its floral designs, the philosophical implications of its representation of the Garden of Paradise in wool and silk, all speak of a civilization that had extraordinary things to say about beauty and order and their relationship. The Iranian plateau taught its people that life is difficult, that the desert is always at the edge of the possible, that water is sacred, that the mountain is both shelter and barrier, that beauty requires effort and intention. These lessons, absorbed over thousands of years, gave Iranian civilization a particular quality, a capacity for endurance, a love of what is delicate and precious, a tendency to find in poetry and philosophy the meanings that political circumstances denied. The empire the world forgot was never truly forgotten, not by the people who lived in it. The memory of Cyrus was kept alive through the Shahnameh and through the Zoroastrian diaspora and through the Jewish tradition that remembered him as a deliverer. The memory of the Safavid Golden Age is written in the blue tiles of Isfahan, which still glitter under the desert sun for anyone who goes to look. The memory of Mossadegh is kept alive by everyone in Iran who has ever felt that their country's fate was being decided by powers that cared nothing for Iranian dignity. The story of Iran is the story of a civilization that has refused to stop. It has been burned and conquered and divided and isolated and sanctioned and shocked by revelation, and every time something fundamental has survived. The language, the poetry, the sense that there is something at the center of Iranian experience that cannot be taken away, because it is not a political structure or a military force, but an understanding of what it means to be human in this particular place, between these particular mountains, under this particular sky. Cyrus wrote, "Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." After 2,500 years, the Persian civilization he did so much to build is still breathing, still arguing with itself and with the world, still insisting that it has something important to say. History, when you trace it this far back and this far forward, has a way of changing the scale at which you see the present. The Islamic Republic is 45 years old, younger than many of the people it governs. The Safavid dynasty lasted 2 centuries. The Parthians lasted 4.5 centuries. The Achaemenids lasted 220 years, and are still remembered as one of the foundational experiences of human political life. Whatever happens in Iran in the coming decades, and things will happen because they always do, will be one more chapter in a story that has been unfolding for 5,000 years. That is both humbling and somehow reassuring. Empires fall, dynasties collapse, political systems fail, but the land remains between its mountains, and the people remain in the land, and the language remains in the people, and in the language, the memory of everything that has come before, the fire, the garden, the poetry, the struggle, the stubborn, magnificent insistence on existing. And so tonight's journey reaches its quiet end. We have traced the story of one of the oldest civilizations in human history across 5,000 years, from the first settled villages in the Zagros foothills to the streets of modern Tehran. It is a story that most of the world has been told incompletely, if at all, a story whose depths reward any amount of attention you give them. Let that knowledge settle gently now. The fire temples of the Sasanians have long since gone dark, but the tradition they embodied is still alive in the Parsi communities of Mumbai and in the Iranian villages where Nowruz is celebrated with bonfires on the last Wednesday of the year. The carved reliefs of Persepolis still show the delegations of all the world's peoples bringing their gifts in dignity. The gardens of Isfahan are still ordered around their water channels. The history of Iran is one of the great human stories, and it is not finished yet. It is simply pausing, as all stories do, to take a breath before continuing. Let the mountains be your walls tonight. Let the rivers carry the day's weight away. Let the language that invented the word paradise give you, for a few quiet hours, something close to it. Sleep well.